I'm the Dolphin of France. This video is purely for entertainment and does not infringe on copyrights or laws. The rights to the novel and image belong to the original author. We do not claim ownership. Don't like waiting and want to listen to this fanfic in full now? Subscribe to our Patreon, where you'll find the best fanfics. Chapter 351. The two most powerful women in Europe. The young nobles who came with Caloris and Marissa began to whisper and glanced at them with playful eyes from time to time. They have been showing off to everyone about their participation in the exhibition for more than a month, and everyone's ears are numb. As a result, I came here with great fanfare today, but saw nothing. No, there must be a mistake somewhere. Callus defended loudly. My painting was really exhibited. I have to ask the person in charge of the exhibition. Marissa quickly found a steward of Sherry Castle. After listening to her question, the latter took her towards the third floor, and Callus followed quickly. The steward opened a utility room on the floor, lit the candlestick, and gestured to the table in the corner with an apologetic expression. I'm sorry, dear lady, due to the large number of termites in room 229, the paintings there were somewhat affected. It is no longer suitable for exhibition. Sherry Castle will compensate you double for the losses caused. Caloris rushed forward, found her work from a pile of scattered scrolls, and quickly unfolded it, but she was stunned on the spot. This book was first published on 69 book bar 69, providing you with a reading experience with no wrong chapters, and no chapters out of order. Under the candlelight, there were several traces of the reaction between formic acid and paint on her paintings, and even the body of a termite. If such a painting is displayed, it will undoubtedly become a source of laughter. Filiberto's assistant was very careful in his work. If the boss said there was a termite disaster, he would definitely arrange everything as if there was a real termite disaster. Callus suddenly let out a piercing scream and ran downstairs crying. In the main exhibition hall on the first floor of Chateau Cherry, Alexandra, who was wearing the most popular light green dress of the season in Paris, had no idea about the bloody scene on the second floor. She was following the etiquette and putting on the most standard ladylike appearance. Accompanied by Alexei and the Russian ambassador to France, Count Alexander Sergeyevich Stroganov, she slowly walked out of the room, passing by rows of beautiful paintings. This is Mr. Lorraine's masterpiece. Count Stroganov looked at the painting Ursula's Voyage on the ship on the wall and couldn't help but exclaimed in a low voice. He is an out-and-out art connoisseur. If there hadn't been an important task assigned by His Majesty the Emperor today, he would have spent most of the day admiring this famous painting. Just after the Russian appreciation group lingered in the exhibition hall for nearly an hour, a melodious sound of trumpets suddenly came from outside Charlie Castle, and then the band began to play. There was a sudden commotion among the crowd, and then began to flow out of the exhibition hall. Count Stroganov looked at Alexei and whispered, Count Bogulinsky, they should be here. The latter nodded, knowing that the ambassador mentioned meant the French king and queen. He hurriedly motioned for Alexandra to also walk towards the door. Not long after, Louis XVI and Queen Mary appeared at the entrance of the exhibition hall. At the reminder of the attendant, they immediately noticed the gorgeously dressed Russian Grand Duchess and his entourage. Seeing the Dharma King coming this way, Alexandra and others rushed to greet him and saluted very solemnly. It is a great honor and surprise to meet you here, Queen. Mary looked at the sweet-looking girl with thick braids in front of her with some surprise and smiled kindly. I'm also very happy to meet you. Welcome to Paris, the capital of art. Afterwards, Alexandra and her group naturally followed Queen Mary to visit the painting exhibition. The little girl quickly gave up her position at her uncle's signal. Count Stroganov, the ambassador to France, took 2 steps forward, came to the side of the French queen, and said respectfully, Your Majesty, the Emperor ordered me to my sincere greetings to you and His Majesty the King. Please thank Your Majesty for your concern for me. Queen Mary nodded politely. Stroganov and the Queen were also familiar with each other. He immediately started chatting about artworks. After visiting nearly half of the exhibits on the first floor, he turned the topic to the mission of his trip. His Majesty the Emperor is very grateful to you. Admire it. His Majesty has repeatedly praised the ministers, saying that the financial, military, and judicial reforms you have led in recent years have been extremely successful, and at the same time, you have made achievements in foreign affairs that have attracted the attention of the whole of Europe. Queen Mary blinked. Although she felt something was strange, she still nodded slightly. Yes, France has indeed developed well in the past 2 years, and has also acquired a province in Tunisia. Stroganov continued. His Majesty the Emperor particularly admires your North African strategy, which has achieved fruitful gains with minimal impact on the international pattern with its amazing strategic layout. At the same time, His Majesty also expressed his high appreciation for your support to our country in the Black Sea and your consistent attitude towards the Ottomans. He quietly took a look at Queen Mary and saw that she seemed calm, and he secretly admired her in his heart. As expected, as His Majesty the Emperor said, the Queen of France was the only woman on the entire European continent who could compare with her, as ambitious as she is, and as talented as she is. They each led their country step by step out of trouble, and ushered in vigorous development. In fact, Queen Mary was not calm, but rather confused. What strategy could she recommend in North Africa? Isn't it that their bey couldn't stand the Ottoman rule and admired France, so he came to ask for annexation to France? Why did you support Russia in the Black Sea? How come they are unanimous about Osman? What is he saying? Stroganov took a breath and continued. In addition, His Majesty the Emperor fully agrees with the Swedish plan mentioned by your foreign minister, Archbishop Talleyrand, when he went to Petersburg 2 months ago. Your Majesty thinks, please, wait a moment. Queen Mary's brain is overloaded. What Swedish plan? Excuse me, what exactly did Archbishop Talleyrand say? Stroganov nodded secretly. He was indeed a cautious and rigorous ruler. He was worried that his foreign minister's description of the policy was not accurate enough, so he asked me to repeat it in person. He coughed lightly and said, Archbishop Talleyrand said that you support Russia's claim to eastern Sweden, and the Gulf of Finland should become Russia's inland sea. Queen Mary became increasingly confused. She had no idea that this was Joseph's big cake for Russia. At this time, the Russo-Swedish War was raging, and Russia's powerful army had gained considerable advantages. Catherine II must be thinking about how to tear off an extra piece of flesh from Sweden, but she was worried about Europe. The powers would intervene. So Joseph gave in to his wishes and expressed France's consent to Russia's occupation of eastern Sweden. As long as Russia's eyes are still fixed on Sweden, Poland will be safe. Historically, it was precisely because Sweden defeated Russia in the Battle of Svenskasund in 1790 and cut off the latter's idea of Swedish territory that Catherine II turned her hunting target to Poland. Chapter 352. The ambition of Catherine II. If you don't want the interests of Austria and Prussia to converge, you must first prevent the partition of Poland from happening. So for Joseph, he can only suffer Sweden first. If King Gustav III of Sweden knew his thoughts, he would probably give him a thumbs up and shout, "You are great, you are noble." 69. Booked bar. Of course, Joseph did not intend to indulge Russia's wanton expansion. On the contrary, he was very wary of Russia's endless desire for territory. The title of European gendarmerie is no joke. Once the huge Russia finds the feeling of fighting, its troops will sweep the heart of the European continent. Historically, just 20 years later in 1814, the Russian army surrounded Tsar Alexander I and entered Paris. The reason why Joseph pushed Russia to the Swedish front was because he knew very well that Sweden could definitely withstand the Russian onslaught. Even if they failed to defeat the Russian army in the Battle of Svenskasund, there would definitely be a comeback victory later. There is no other reason. Just because Britain is behind Sweden. Britain is also very concerned about Russia's expansion. They have always adhered to the policy of continental balance, and will not allow a powerful country that overwhelms other forces to appear on the European continent. So Sweden is the bridgehead used by the British to block Russia's westward advance. As for Poland, the British don't care so much. After all, even if Russia can annex Poland, the whole of Germany, including Austria and Prussia, will stand in front of it, making it difficult for it to continue to reach out to the west. Once Sweden is lost, Russia will roam freely in the entire Baltic Sea, and Britain will most likely have to face the Russian army directly. Historically, Russia won consecutive victories in the early stages of the war with Sweden. And then Britain began to intervene strongly and joined Prussia to put pressure on Russia's ally Denmark. After gaining some benefits, Denmark quickly announced its withdrawal from the war. Sweden was able to concentrate all its forces to deal with Russia, and finally defeated the Russians with the large-scale assistance of Britain, and took back all the land lost in the early stages of the war with the Treaty of Versailles. Therefore, Joseph strongly supported Russia to fight Sweden. On the one hand, it would give Poland more breathing space to complete the integration of the country. On the other hand, Sweden could be used to consume Britain. France did not have to invest anything except talking, which was definitely a very cost-effective deal. However, this seemed too exciting for Queen Mary. She waited for the Russian ambassador Stroganov to finish speaking, and her eyes widened, trying to recall whether Talleyrand had submitted such an important report on national strategic planning to her, and Stroganov thought she had acquiesced, so he moved closer to her and lowered his voice a few decibels. Your Majesty, His Majesty the Emperor thanks you for your position. At present, Prussia and Austria are fighting fiercely in Silesia, and France has also intervened in the war there on a large scale. His Majesty the Emperor understands your claim to the Low Countries very well, and is ready to support you at any time. No. Queen Mary was still thinking about Sweden, and her brain was even less capable after hearing this. France had no idea about the Low Countries. Did the Russian ambassador drink too much? If Joseph were here, he would be very shocked. The French army is still hovering on the border of Liege, and Luxembourg is still legally part of Austria. Catherine II saw his thoughts on the southern Netherlands. This woman is worthy of being one of the most outstanding tsars in modern Russia. This strategic vision alone is enough to overwhelm the European powers. Of course, she used her own ambition to guess the French strategy. In fact, Joseph only wanted the Wallonia region in the south. Eating too much at once will make you full. Count Stroganov continued, but His Majesty the Emperor believes that France's strategy should not stop at the Low Countries. Queen Mary immediately shook her head. I never thought that the Low Countries. Yes, I understand. The Russian ambassador thought she wanted to say the Low Countries were never the ultimate goal, so he nodded immediately. His Majesty the Emperor also believes that what you have in mind is the broad Rhine River. He raised his right hand to his chest and waved it vigorously, but that is definitely a difficult goal to achieve. Oh, I'm not questioning your strength, but with France facing the entire Germany, please believe that Britain, Italy and even Sweden will be hostile to France because of this. It will be a protracted war, and will bring huge losses to France, and if France and Russia join forces, the situation will be very different, as long as His Majesty's army can cross Poland. Of course, this must be after the war between our country and Sweden ends. We can provide you with strong support from Eastern Austria. As for the subsequent strategy, perhaps you and His Majesty the Emperor will have to discuss in detail to determine it. His words were very clear. Catherine II wanted to join forces with the French strongwoman to divide the European continent from the east and west. France took the west bank of the Rhine, and Russia obtained eastern Sweden and Poland. In the end, the two armies attacked Austria from two directions. As for how far they were going to fight in the end, the two women had to discuss and determine in detail. After Queen Mary's brain repeatedly crashed, she finally determined that the Russian ambassador was drunk. What Low Countries? What Rhine River? What facing the whole of Germany? He couldn't be so drunk just by drinking wine. He must have drunk a whole bottle of vodka. After she figured this out, she immediately regained her composure and looked at Stroganov with a smile. You are really good at joking. Maybe you need to take a rest? De Benenac, please tell someone to prepare a rest room. Stroganov was a little anxious and said hurriedly, His Majesty the Emperor asked me to convey to you that in Europe today, only France and Russia can bring a new order. Although France is currently facing some financial problems, under your rule France will eventually become stronger. He suddenly turned sideways and signaled to Alexandra. Oh, you see, His Majesty the Emperor is absolutely sincere in promoting closer ties between our two countries. Queen Mary still maintained a tolerant and polite smile towards the drunkard. Okay, I'm very grateful to your Majesty for your sincerity. So, do you need to go to the lounge to eat something first? Stroganov was slightly startled and confirmed that he had expressed everything clearly. Then the French Queen's words meant that he needed time to think about it. So he stroked his chest and bowed. Then I won't disturb your appreciation of the art, Joseph. who was far away in Luxembourg, never expected that his previous series of operations would actually inspire such huge ambitions of Catherine I. If Queen Mary really chooses her granddaughter to be the crown princess, then there will definitely be a tremor throughout Europe. Chapter 353 Luxembourg Steel Center. The reason why Catherine II has such a strategic plan is by no means a whim. The basis of everything is of course the ability demonstrated by France in the past 2 years. Whether it is the royal family's control of power or the profound strategy demonstrated in North Africa and the Low Countries, she believes that this is the best partner. However, Russia's former ally Austria has fallen into the chaos brought about by the reform, and its national strength is getting worse and worse. In particular, the unsuccessful suppression of the Brabant uprising, and the bitter battle in Silesia, made her very disappointed with Austria. Although Prussia, another German power, signed a secret agreement with Russia to divide Poland, it was limited to dealing with Poland. Prussia is now in the same boat with the British. On major issues involving the European order, they will definitely give priority to the British opinion. Moreover, Prussia's troops are now trapped in Silesia. Who knows when they can get out. In addition, Catherine II planned to join forces with France for another important consideration. Compared with Russia's goals, Sweden, Poland, and the Black Sea coast, the European powers paid more attention to France's goals, the Low Countries and the Rhine River basin. The Low Countries are Britain's forbidden fruit, and the Rhine River is Germany's traditional sphere of influence. If France really takes action on these two places, then the attention of the whole of Europe will immediately fall on him. At that time, Russia can take the opportunity to feast without worrying about the opinions of other powers. Of course, if France can really take the Rhine River under the pressure of the whole of Europe, Catherine II will not mind cooperating with the troops. Perhaps under their east-west attack, even Austria can be swallowed. The next morning, the diplomatic officials put the plan submitted by Count Stroganov on the further development of Russian-French trade on Queen Mary's desk. Queen Mary opened the document with some reluctance and began to frown. After reading a few pages, she was really not good at this. She was about to call Archbishop Brian, but suddenly remembered that the crown prince seemed to be very good at this. Didn't Joseph also open a trading company with Count Bobulinski of Russia? It is said that the business is very good, which has increased the trade volume between France and Russia several times. When she thought of this, she summoned the maid and asked her to send the trade plan to the crown prince for processing. Luxembourg. In the open land not far from the giant open pit iron mine Iron Sea, several tower-like iron blast furnaces are under intense construction. Viscount Olivier, the owner of Silk Steel Company, stood on a hillside, watching his new ironworks taking shape in a happy mood. He spent less than 40,000 livres to acquire a large-scale ironworks in Luxembourg, and got more than 700 skilled workers alone. Then he began to expand and innovate technology. Right next to the old iron-making blast furnace he acquired, craftsmen were using refractory bricks to build two square buildings the size of ordinary houses. The two buildings were almost completely sealed, with only two thick pipes as high as an adult's abdomen connecting them, and the ends of the pipes were connected to the blast furnace. There was also a high-pressure steam engine next to each square building, which blew air into the pipes through a mechanical device. This was the hot blast iron-making technology that Joseph brought to the French ironworks. In fact, the principle is very simple. Fuel combustion during iron making requires a lot of oxygen. Traditional iron making blast furnaces directly obtain air from the outside world, and the temperature of this air is room temperature. After entering the blast furnace of thousands of degrees, the furnace temperature will inevitably be lowered. The furnace temperature that the blast furnace of this era can reach is just barely enough to melt the iron in the iron ore, but it can usually only be burned into viscous molten iron and flow out from the bottom of the blast furnace. The quality of such molten iron will definitely not be too high. Because of insufficient melting, impurities will be wrapped inside, and the slag making agent cannot be dissolved evenly. The technology brought by Joseph is to use a hot air chamber to heat the air in advance, and then blow it into the blast furnace under pressure. This can prevent cold air from lowering the furnace temperature, and at the same time, pressurized blasting can also increase the amount of oxygen for combustion. This Simple measure alone can increase the furnace temperature by nearly 200 degrees coupled with the use of coke with a higher calorific value. The blast furnace of the French ironworks can completely melt the iron in the iron ore point. The completely fluid molten iron can fully contact with the air, oxidize a large amount of harmful impurities such as silicon and sulfur contained in it, and further precipitate impurities. By adding slag forming agents, the quality of the molten iron produced in this way can be close to the level of crude steel. By adjusting the carbon content at the end of the blast furnace, the iron ingots from the blast furnace can meet the requirements of most iron products without almost entering the crucible for steel making. Point after trial production in the Nancy Industrial Development Zone in France, the iron ingots produced by Viscount Olivier's ironworks sold for 3/4 of the price of fine steel, and they were in short supply. He had someone estimate that after the factory built in Luxembourg is fully operational, the annual output can reach £200 million. This factory alone produces more steel than the total steel output of France last year. In addition to the convenience brought by the Seine-Rhine trade agreement, his iron ingots and steel can be smoothly sold in many countries in southern Germany, and there are no more checkpoints and tax officials along the way when selling goods to Germany. This factory in Luxembourg will bring him at least 800,000 livres in revenue next year. He will become the top rich man in France, and it all started from the moment he decided to invest and build a factory in Nancy Industrial Development Zone. He always told people that it was the best decision he had ever made in his life. Not far away, his old rival Mr. Gregor came over and bowed to him. "You said the war will not spread here." Mr. Gregor stopped and looked at the ironworks he invested on the other side and said with some worry, "I invested most of my wealth in Luxembourg." Viscount Olivier smiled. "You should have heard that the government has started building a wooden track from Luxembourg to Verdun. The government will not make such a large investment if it is not certain." "You're right." "Oh, Mr. Gregor is here too." The general manager of the Wahori steel plant appeared out of nowhere, saluted the two of them, and continued, "And I heard that the second thing to build is not wooden tracks, but iron tracks. Got, how much will that cost?" Viscount Olivier was halfway through speaking when he suddenly paused. "Yes, this is Luxembourg. There is nothing else, but there is as much iron as you need. The price won't be too expensive." His eyes immediately lit up. If the government wanted to build iron tracks, it would definitely purchase large quantities of iron ingots from its own ironworks, or he should mortgage his property in Nancy and take out loans to expand more iron-making blast furnaces in Luxembourg. That's exactly what Joseph's plan was trying to accomplish. Using Luxembourg's low-priced iron, we will launch a trial production of rails, train track-laying craftsmen, and at the same time significantly increase the sales of iron smelting plants, thereby further reducing their costs. Chapter 354 Joseph's Teacher. Although this section of railroad that spans most of Luxembourg is expensive, once it is connected to the wooden track in Verdun, although the material is different, the technical parameters such as the track gauge are exactly the same, and the carriages running on the track can pass directly. In France, the wooden track in Lorraine will be connected to the Verdun part in a few months. At that time, Luxembourg's iron ingots can be transported to Nancy in large quantities for further refining, or used to manufacture steam engines, boring machines and other machinery. Bookbar. At the same time, French industrial products can also be transported from Nancy to Luxembourg, and then sold from here to the southern Netherlands and even the Netherlands. Although the transportation capacity of wooden tracks plus horse-drawn carriages is far less than that of trains, it can instantly kill the horse-drawn carriage road transportation of this era, and its convenience is far superior to river transportation. Moreover, Joseph was also going to set up a steam engine auxiliary dragging system on the steeper sections along the way, to assist the horses to go uphill, thereby greatly reducing the consumption of horsepower. Freight transportation is the foundation of commerce, and commerce is a basis for ensuring the virtuous cycle of industry. It can be said that the large number of wooden tracks built in France has laid a solid foundation for the start of France's industrialization. Compared with other European countries with the same output, French factories can rely on wooden rail transportation to achieve higher sales and reach a more distant customer base. so as to recover funds faster and invest in the next round of production or research and development. It can be foreseen that even without Joseph's help for French industry, France can gain a huge advantage in the Industrial Revolution with rail transportation alone. And the construction of wooden tracks seems to have cost the French government a lot of money, but in fact, the money finally went into the pockets of French ironworks, lumber yards, craftsmen, and even people of all classes who served craftsmen. Then the money will enter the French economic cycle through consumption and promote the country's economic development. This was later called GDP growth. More than a century later, the US President Roosevelt brought economic revival to the United States by building a large number of roads, bridges, and other infrastructure. As for the source of funds for the wooden track, the French Reserve Bank is still providing loans for the time being. However, Joseph has asked the Minister of Commerce to start planning to raise funds from the private sector in the form of local government debt plus wooden track equity. With these fundraising models that are very common in later generations, the French private sector can definitely provide a huge amount of funds when it comes to people's livelihood and infrastructure construction. Just as French steel manufacturers were expanding in Luxembourg, Joseph had led the Guards Corps to the border between Luxembourg and Liege. According to the combat plan previously formulated by the General Staff, they will continue to go north, passing through Jülich in Bavaria, taking the desolate mountain road at the junction of Aachen and Liege to bypass Blücher's army, and then turn west sharply and go straight to Antolf. Antolf is a province north of Brussels, and it is an important birthplace of the Brabant Uprising. Yes, Joseph's target is not Karl II's Hanover army, but Antolf further north. Berthier turned around and looked at the dark red rolling hills behind him, and then at the vaguely visible Rare River in front of him. After hesitating for a moment, he urged his horse to catch up with the horse of His Royal Highness the Crown Prince. Your Highness, he organized his words. Look, we are about to leave Luxembourg. I still think it is safer for you to stay in Luxembourg City. This battle is different from the previous ones. We have to go deep into the enemy's hinterland, and there is no sufficient logistical support. What if you, Joseph, raised his hand and interrupted him with a smile. Thank you very much for your concern, Mr. Chief of Staff, but no matter what danger I encounter, I must be with my army. He gestured to the soldiers of the guards who were quietly marching beside him. With these bravest soldiers, I will not be in any danger. Joseph knew very well that only by going through life and death with the soldiers, they will truly believe in you and support you. If the army is bleeding on the front line and you are sitting in the palace and spending money, don't blame the soldiers for being alienated from you. Napoleon could become the eternal god in the hearts of the French because he fought battle after battle at the front, and he went to war with the army as the supreme commander. So the victory of the army was his victory. If any officer wanted to dominate the army with his prestige, he would not be able to overcome him. In 18th century Europe, only the king who could lead the army to fight could control the situation and win the respect and support of all classes from nobles to peasants. As for the danger mentioned by Berthier, Joseph also had a sense of measure in his heart. Not to mention that he had enough confidence in the combat effectiveness of the Guards Corps. Even if he encountered an accident, there was still the rule of ransom in this era. Any nobleman of status who was captured would be entertained by the enemy with good food and drink and taken care of in every possible way. As long as the prisoner of war could pay a ransom, he could return to his home in a decent manner. The enemy would even send him several miles away before leaving. So, unless he was unlucky enough to be hit directly by a shell, he was usually in the position of the commander-in-chief, and it was impossible for a bullet to shoot so far. Otherwise there was basically no possibility of being killed on the spot. The worst case scenario is that they have to pay the ransom and go home. When the soldiers nearby heard what Joseph said about the bravest warrior, they immediately cheered in a low voice. Long live His Royal Highness the Crown Prince. Always protect His Royal Highness the Crown Prince. Courage, glory. Berthier looked at the excited soldiers and sighed helplessly. Your Highness, I believe that this scene will appear in the stories told by people decades later. At the front of the marching column, Napoleon confusedly distinguished on the map, and then looked at the colonel officer beside him. Commander, we seem to be heading towards Bavaria, although He was a little surprised, since the morning, why they were marching in silence today. It was not until this time that he realized that the Guards Corps was not going to intercept the Hanoverian army as rumored. Colonel Dumont nodded and whispered, "Yes, the target isn't Torf. In order to avoid the Prussians, we have to cross the barren mountains south of Aachen and Torf." Napoleon was a little surprised. What about the Hanoverian army? The army of Karl II was already in the southeast of Brussels, while Torf was north of Brussels, which meant that they had to go around behind the Hanoverian army. Colonel Dumont smiled and said a few more words to the artillery major, who had performed quite well recently. Originally, the General Staff planned to meet Charles II west of Longchamp, but His Royal Highness the Crown Prince proposed to implement the circumvention tactic to mobilize the enemy's defense line. Chapter 355, Going Deep Behind Enemy Lines. Napoleon was startled when he heard this. He had seen the circuit and insertion tactic in the officer textbook of the Paris Police Academy, but he only had a rough understanding of it and had no idea how to use it. He looked at the regiment leader again. However, if you ignore the Hanover army and once they merge with the Prussians, it will be difficult for General Leo to resist them. Colonel Dumont nodded slightly. "Actually, I had the same question as you at the last staff meeting." He immediately smiled. "But you have to think about it, whether it is the Hanovers or the Prussians, the reason why their armies can set foot in the southern Netherlands lies in the rebellion of the Dutch. The first release of this book provides you with a reading experience with no wrong chapters and no out of order chapters. If Antolfo is captured by us, the Dutch rebel parliament will die with it. So even if the Prussians defeat General Leo, what can they do? Directly occupy the southern Netherlands. I'm afraid the Netherlands neither the British nor the British will agree." Napoleon suddenly realized, so Karl II must rescue Antolfo. Yes. His Royal Highness the Crown Prince said that, as long as we march faster than the Hanoverians and threaten Antolfo before they reach Liège, then the Austrian army will not be in any danger. However, Napoleon pondered, it does not seem like a wise decision for us to go deep into the southern Netherlands and fight the enemy in the rebels' home base. Karl II could even cut off our supply lines and wait for us to surrender. Colonel Dumont shook his riding crop, who said there was going to be a decisive battle in Antolfo. "Your understanding of the detour and insertion tactic is still not deep enough." He paused as he spoke, feeling a little ashamed. In fact, he himself had not done much research on this tactic. It was just that he attended the staff meeting and listened to the Crown Prince's explanation so that he could give Napoleon instructions according to the script. Detour and intersperse are actually two tactics. The goal is to control the battlefield situation and put the enemy in a disadvantageous situation. After mobilizing Karl II to return north, our army will. He suddenly paused. The military deployment behind it was the highest level of confidentiality, and it seemed that Major Buwanaba's level was not yet accessible. You will know soon. After all, His Royal Highness the Crown Prince is definitely a tactical genius when it comes to commanding military operations. Joseph, who only attended the military academy for a year and a half, may not be as good as any school-level officer in the Guards Corps, but he has hundreds of years of advanced tactical theories in his mind, and has a large number of actual combat cases. Many tactical theories are like this. It is actually very simple to put it bluntly. If you just apply one to the battle situation at hand, you can suppress opponents who do not understand this kind of tactics. For example, on the current European battlefield, generals focus on how to optimally deploy their formations frontally and from which angle to attack, and rarely think about large-scale roundabout tactics. Even a genius like Frederick the Great, at most, could only move within a war zone level. And he was already able to overwhelm his contemporary opponents. But what Joseph brought was the theory of the king of detours in the East in later generations, which was enough for Karl II to drink a pot. Of course, even if they were facing the Hanover army head-on, Joseph believed that the Guards Corps still had a greater chance of winning. Although the Guards Corps could devote less than 14,000 troops to fight Karl II, 2 regiments were left to Leo in case he was penetrated by Blücher. Then Joseph had to be busy rush back to fight in the defense of Luxembourg. There are also soldiers from the Milan army staying in Luxembourg to maintain law and order. After deducting the casualties from previous battles, these soldiers are the only ones left, but based on the training, morale, and equipment level of the Guards Corps, it is impossible to deal with 24,000. The combined forces of Hun and Dutch still have a greater chance of winning point. However, a head-on fight with an enemy with superior strength is likely to cause the Guards Corps to suffer relatively large casualties, which is something Joseph is unwilling to accept. There are also many favorable conditions for making circuitous crossings in the southern Netherlands. For example, in the French-speaking area of the southern Netherlands, the French army was even more popular than the Brabant rebels, and could easily obtain logistical supplies. In addition, Austria's rule over the southern Netherlands for decades also laid a deep foundation. There are Austrian officials everywhere. Even if they are ousted, they can still provide intelligence, materials and other support to Joseph. The most critical thing is that the southern Netherlands has too many things that must be saved for Prussia and Hanover, which gives Joseph a lot of tactical leverage. North of Brussels in the southern Netherlands Parliament, the Liberal member of Parliament under Van de Noort pointed at Onk, who was sitting in the front row with a red face. Now the Hanoverian army is rushing to Liege. We should cooperate with them and defeat them in one fell swoop. Austrians, and you put the army in hiding. This is our fight as southern Netherlands people, our fight for freedom and democracy. You are ruining the future of southern Netherlands. Arnk was unmoved at all, and the members of his group responded skillfully. Freedom and the people must be alive first. Our troops are very tired after fierce battles. At the right time, they will invest again fighting. The core conservative MPs at the meeting had been informed by Onk that he had reached a secret agreement with the French. As long as the southern Netherlands did not intervene in the war between France and Prussia and other countries, after the war was over, France would support the independence of the southern Netherlands, as long as it took the southern province of Nemunas. Onk never thought that the weak southern Netherlands could challenge Austria alone. The only question left was whether to side with Prussia or France. As far as he knew, Prussia and Britain agreed with the Netherlands' annexation of the southern Netherlands. In comparison, France's appetite for Nemunas was much smaller. Moreover, a considerable number of conservative MPs came from the French-speaking area and were more willing to cooperate with France. After learning about the agreement between Onk and France, some conservative MPs even wanted to mobilize the forces in the southern region to assist France in driving out the Prussians. Just as the Liberal MPs were preparing to refute, they saw an officer forcefully push away the guards on both sides of the gate and rush into the venue like a frightened buffalo. Van der Noort frowned. The military has been getting more and more outrageous recently. He was about to make trouble when he heard the officer shouting in fear. The main force of the French army has passed through the east of Brussels and is less than 10 miles away from Antwerp. 10 miles is about 16 kilometers, and it will take a day and a half to reach the destination. Under normal circumstances, the entire southern Netherlands Parliament all suddenly fell into silence. After 7 or 8 seconds, Van der Noort suddenly shouted, "Quick! Ask for help from His Excellency Charles II. His army should not have gone far." Chapter 356 On-side supplies and banknotes. As the messenger asking for help from the Hanoverian army set off, Van de Noort, the Speaker of the Parliament of the Southern Netherlands, still felt uneasy. He quickly wrote a letter and gave it to a member of Parliament who had good relations with the British, asking him to find it in person. Then he proposed a temporary motion, requiring General Wood to lead the main force of the Southern Netherlands National Guard to immediately return to defend Brussels, and temporarily recruit 6,000 soldiers. The Parliament of the Southern Netherlands is in disarray. On the conservative side, members of the House of Representatives surrounded Onk and asked questions. "President Onk, you said you would not let us interfere in the decisive battle between the French and the Prussian army, but now the French army suddenly ran to our rear. Perhaps you should contact the French again to confirm your secret agreement. It's all your suggestion. Our troops are staying in Ghent." Wenke clutched his cane with a livid face, and after a long time, he whispered with trembling lips, "I will confirm it, but the French must have a reason. They may be heading for the Dutch, and Antolfo is right next to Breda in the Netherlands. He must not admit at this time that he was being used by France, otherwise the liberal congressman would beat him to death on the spot. Yes, that must be the case. He seemed to have found the answer, and his voice suddenly became louder. This time the Netherlands turned its back on France and turned to Britain. It is not surprising that the French want to teach them a lesson. He stood up as he spoke, his eyes shining. In this case, we should cooperate with the French army's actions to take the opportunity to eliminate the Austrian forces in the territory and also force the Netherlands to give up its plan to unite the southern Netherlands. The conservative members of the southern Netherlands were mainly large capital aristocrats, as well as a small number of enlightened aristocrats. They only joined the uprising because Joseph II wanted to increase business taxes and weaken their privileges as long as they could get rid of the Austrian government's reform policy. They didn't care whether to introduce French influence or surrender to the British point. As for the freedom, human rights and independence advocated by liberals, they have no interest at all and are even somewhat resistant to it. Pointank's words immediately aroused the approval of some conservative lawmakers, especially those from the south. It is said that France has recently introduced a series of laws that are conducive to the development of industry and commerce and has opened up the South German market. They even have the idea that, even if it is merged with France, it is not impossible to consider southern Netherlands, northern province of Namen. Karel II sent away the members of the southern Netherlands who came to ask for help and said to the herald with a dark face, "Order the entire army to turn around immediately and return to Antolfo." General Bronkhorst, the commander of the Dutch army, frowned and said, "The French want to quickly eliminate the southern Netherlands army and restore Austria's rule here, so that we lose the reason to intervene." "You are right, General." Karel II turned his horse's head and said in a cold voice, "But they made a fatal mistake. Antwerp and Brussels are both in the hands of the Parliament of the Southern Netherlands. The French army is too deep and the supply line can easily be cut off by us, and as long as they can't break through Antolfo quickly, our army can attack their backs after they rescue them." He squeezed the horse's belly with his legs and said, "I want the French to pay for their recklessness." Soon, the Chinese and Dutch combined forces stopped advancing and began to turn under the orders of the officers running back and forth. However, it was not easy for the 24,000 strong army to change its direction, and it took a kilometer-long march. It took the officers more than 2 hours to make every soldier understand Karel II's order, and what followed was chaotic coordination. Some of the fast-moving legions completed the turn and began to move north, while the slow-moving legions were still forming their formation on the spot. They collided with the former, and both sides were immediately unable to move. The artillerymen complained even more. Due to the tight connection between the cart and the horse, they had to first untie the cannon weighing several hundred kilograms from the horse, then use manpower to turn it 180 degrees, and at the same time drive the horse to the other side, and then rehitch the cart. At the same time, the ammunition transport vehicle is also similar, but it is more difficult to turn. Sometimes a clear space had to be set aside for the horse to pull the ammunition cart in a large circle to complete the U-turn. From the time when the members of the southern Netherlands came to ask for help at noon, the army was busy until 5:30 in the afternoon, when they finally started marching north again. And after they walked for about an hour, they had to set up camp for the night. Outskirts of Antolfo. Joseph could already vaguely see the outline of the city. He was about to convene his staff to discuss the next course of action. If the Hanoverian army was slow to respond, he would not mind trying to attack Antolfo to stimulate Caroline. At this moment, 2 dust-covered hussars rushed over and said in a tired voice, "Report. The Hanover and Dutch coalition forces have returned north and entered Brussels yesterday afternoon." Upon hearing this, Joseph and Berthia looked at each other and both smiled. The enemy's situation was exactly as they had expected. In this case, the strategic initiative fell into the hands of the Guards Corps. To be honest, Joseph was really afraid that Karel II was a fool and went to join the Prussian army regardless. In that case, he would have to make a hasty march back to Liege to rescue Leo. Although it is possible to launch a pincer attack, there are too many uncertainties. For example, if Leo collapses after 2 days, Luxembourg will be in danger. Fortunately, the commander of Hanover is a mature and steady general, and he did not ignore political factors, and decided to go back to rescue the southern Netherlands uprising point without Joseph's order. Berthier immediately said to the herald, "Immediately let the detachment collecting supplies return." The chief of staff looked at his pocket watch. "Others rest in place and set off for Ghent on time at 3 p.m. Yes, General." Soon, the company collecting supplies drove the carriage to join the main force of the Guards Corps. Unlike what Napoleon did back then, Joseph strictly ordered the supply detachment to pay the farmers, and it was slightly higher than the market price point. Of course, the payment method is mainly banknotes issued by the French Reserve Bank. After nearly half a year of promotion, this kind of paper money has been quite accepted in France. Most people would only exchange their large denomination banknotes for silver coins or deposit them in banks every half a month. As for the change below 5 livres, it was basically a paper currency market point in the southern Netherlands, which is close to France. French banknotes also appeared, but they were not very popular. Joseph also took advantage of the opportunity of local supply to expand the influence of paper currency. Chapter 357, Going around in circles. Joseph knew how difficult life was for the lower classes in this era. If he took away their food and livestock without paying, the whole family would probably starve to death. In addition, local supply was actually much more economical than transporting through the narrow supply line from France. After all, the transportation costs and losses were gone, so it was really unnecessary to save the farmers' living expenses. In addition, paying for supplies could leave a good impression on the people of the southern Netherlands, making local supply easier in the future. Maybe some locals would take the initiative to send supplies to the guards camp to sell in order to make a little difference. At 3 p.m., the guards began to move southwest, bypassing the south side of Antulf, sticking to the border of Brussels, and heading straight into the province of Ghent. Joseph still rode on the left side of the marching column, waving to the soldiers from time to time to boost morale. And the soldiers responded with excited cheers. Berthier urged his horse to catch up, bowed slightly and said to him, "Your Highness." Major Masson sent a message that he did not choose to attack because the Hanoverian army was in a tight formation. Joseph nodded. He did the right thing. The key to the penetration tactic is not to take advantage of the opportunity, but to prioritize preserving one's own manpower and cut the enemy's formation as completely as possible. Masson's battalion plus 2 companies of soldiers, a total of less than 1,000 people, were mobile forces operating near the Hanoverian army. Joseph's order to him was to implement penetration operations when the enemy was pinned down and in chaos, further disrupting the enemy's formation. At present, there are still too few officers in the Guards Corps who can stand alone. Lefebvre was left to help Leo, and the only one left was Berthier. People like Dauphin and Napoleon are still relatively immature, and their military ranks are not enough to lead a corps alone. As for this Masson, he was quite clever in the previous action in cooperation with the Ankh exercise, so he became the only mobile force. If Napoleon and others could be of great use, or if he could recruit powerful generals such as Massena, Moreau, and Lannes, Joseph would definitely make the Hanoverian army be pierced like a sieve. Talent is always the most valuable resource. Joseph sighed secretly. However, he also knew that the training of the army is not a matter of one day or one night. To be honest, the growth rate of the Guards Corps is already very amazing. I believe that if a more brilliant victory can be achieved in the southern Netherlands this time, the Guards Corps will be able to attract more talents and usher in the next wave of blowouts in the middle and rear of the marching column. Napoleon pulled the head of the regiment to ask, "So, our real goal is Ghent?" Before Colonel Dumont could say anything, he immediately reacted, "No, Ghent has no goal to mobilize the enemy, Colonel." Dumont smiled and said, "That's right. There are only more than 8,000 southern Netherlands rebels there. That's the main force of the rebels." Napoleon's eyes suddenly lit up. "Our goal is not Ghent, but Brussels, Colonel." Dumont looked at the young major in surprise. When he was in the staff meeting, he had no idea that there was any connection between Ghent and Brussels. It was not until His Royal Highness the Crown Prince said it that he suddenly realized it. But this Buwana only took a few seconds to figure it out. He asked unwillingly, "Oh, Why do you have this inference, Napoleon? Answered very quickly. It's very simple. If the main force of the rebels in Ghent is eliminated, then Brussels is an apple that can be picked at any time. The rebel parliament will even surrender to us directly. Then, why don't we attack Brussels directly? Colonel Dumont continued to ask. That would put our army in danger. If the Hanoverian army returns quickly, and the main force of the Ghent rebels also go to Brussels at the same time, it is likely to form a pincer attack on our army. Ignoring the surprised look of the regiment commander, he continued, even if the enemy is not well coordinated, our attack on Brussels is likely to cause the rebels' parliament to flee to Ghent. In that case, even if we occupy that city, we will not gain any strategic advantage. After all, it is just an isolated city deep behind enemy lines. Colonel Dumont almost blurted out, all right. He calmed down and coughed dryly. You are really young and promising. Perhaps in a few years, this regiment will be handed over to you. Napoleon simply responded with a thank you for your compliment, but in his heart he was full of admiration for the young prince who proposed this series of tactics. He was less than 16 years old and had only studied military theory at the Paris Police Academy, but he had such incredible command ability. If Corsica had such an outstanding leader, the road to nation building would be smooth sailing. He silently said in his heart. East of Brussels, Karel II looked westward, frowning. General Bronkhorst, the Dutch commander, looked at the intelligence in his hand and wondered. The French only circled around and Dolphin left. To the west? Where are they going? Ghent. Karel II uttered a word, and then reluctantly summoned the herald. Order the whole army to turn west immediately. Order. Speed up the march, and leave all unnecessary baggage to the rear. Speed. I want speed. Yes, Marshal. Bronkhorst hesitated and said, Sir Marshal, if the French want to go to Ghent, we don't have to pay any attention to them. Then what? Karel II said in a low voice. Witt's army is no match for the French. He still clearly remembered that Witt's 5,000 strong army was surrounded by more than 2,000 French regiments, and was almost annihilated. If the main force of the southern Netherlands army is gone, those in Brussels will surrender immediately. Bronkhorst hesitated and immediately understood the connection, and quickly ordered the Dutch army to turn quickly. On the other side, the southern Netherlands rebel army in Ghent also received the news, and began nervously preparing defensive positions. However, just as the Hanoverian army walked northwest for 3 days, and was about to reach Ghent, Karel II suddenly received a report from the hussars, saying that the French army turned again, and headed southeast. Karel II hurriedly unfolded the map, and marked the movements of the French army on it. Then he was shocked to find that in order to pursue the French, he had gone too far north. At this time, the Hanoverian army and the French army were almost the same distance from the scorching sun. He suddenly broke out in a cold sweat. It turned out that the French were going around in circles, and their real target was the Prussian army in Liege. He hurriedly ordered, and immediately went to Liege for reinforcement. What he didn't notice was that because of many days of high-speed marching, the Hanover army, with better quality soldiers, had already pushed the Dutch away by 7 or 8 kilometers. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story, and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 358, The Collapse of Karel II. Please tell Mr. Ang that France still firmly supports the founding of the southern Netherlands. Joseph smiled and signaled to Viscount Flot, as he thought, our army is indeed pursuing the Dutch army. Oh, and thank you for the oats and precious information you brought. It's my honor to serve you and your army. Viscount Flot said some compliments with a red face, then bowed and exited the military tent, not even doubting why the French army came to Ghent. Chase the Dutch army. Yes, he just brought a dozen carts of oats, which are extremely precious warhorse feed, and the news that the Hanoverian army turned south near Brussels. As a southern Netherlands native who was born in Zwolle, Belgium, grew up reading French, and yearned for French life all his life, he had always looked forward to Wallonia's integration into France. then he would be a true Frenchman. So, when he learned that the French army was nearby, which was what his serfs told him, when he wanted to use French banknotes to repay his debt, he immediately came personally with oats and wine to support the army. Of course, for such a rich man, Joseph did not pay the payment. I believe that Viscount Flot is not short of 10,000 or 20,000 livres with this batch of oats. The Guards Corps can reduce the time of on-site replenishment and speed up the march. In fact, since arriving in the southern Netherlands, similar supplies from heaven have been flowing in continuously, and there is even too much wine to carry. After the nobles of the southern Netherlands left, Berthier immediately looked at the Crown Prince. Your Highness, if the information brought by this gentleman is correct, then we have to hope that Major Masson will take action. He came to the map on the table and pointed to the south of Brussels. There are enemy troops from the town of Gialy to the town of Waterloo, which shows that their march is at least 6 kilometers long. The Legion staff officer on the side immediately said, "This may be a good opportunity for us to launch an attack." Joseph also looked at the map, but he was a little hesitant. The Hussars had not yet sent back the specific situation of the enemy army, and he was far away from the Hanover army. If he rushed to the decisive battle immediately, there would still be great uncertainty. He suddenly tapped Antolfo on the map with his hand and said with a smile, "Let's go back again." In the east of Brussels, Major Masson grabbed the hussar who came to report the enemy's situation. His eyes flashed with excitement. "Are you sure the Dutch are still near Waterloo?" "Yes, Mr. Battalion Commander. I saw with my own eyes the Dutch cannons and a large number of tents." The hussar next to him added, "We also heard from the shoemakers in the town that they were still doing business in the Dutch camp yesterday afternoon." At that time, the Hanoverian army had already left for the south. "Great." Masson firmly grasped the hilt of the sword at his waist. "There is at least half a day's gap between the Dutch army and the Hanover army. This is the best way to implement the interspersed tactic mentioned by His Royal Highness the Crown Prince." Chance. He raised his hand and waved to the herald. "Order the whole army to march immediately to Waterloo." "Yes, Battalion Commander." Half a day later, General Bronckhorst glanced at the listless marching column beside him and shook his head helplessly. "Anyone who has to go back and forth 3 times in less than a week will feel bored." He was about to give a speech to boost morale when he saw several hussars galloping towards him in a panic. From a distance, he shouted loudly, "Report, General, the enemy has been found on the northeast side, and the distance is less than 3 kilometers. Bronckhorst frowned. He knew that a group of French troops had been wandering near them, and Marshal Carroll II had sent cavalry to drive them away. However, the French were always far away from them, and seemed to be only responsible for reconnaissance, so they didn't pay much attention. He asked the hussar, "Is it the French army from before?" "It seems they are the ones." The hussar nodded and added hurriedly, "But this time there are more people. There should be thousands of people." Bronckhorst suddenly felt as uncomfortable as if he had eaten a fly. There are thousands of enemy troops who must not be ignored, but his own marching speed is already a bit slow. If he does this, he may fall further behind Carolina. He angrily ordered his staff, "Stop the entire army's advance and line up in the open area south of the town to meet the enemy." "Yes, General." The French army's speed was much faster than Bronckhorst expected. In less than an hour, the French army's skirmishers began to attack the Dutch baggage convoy. He immediately mobilized his infantry lines to squeeze the space of the French army to the west, but the latter was not willing to fight at all. Taking advantage of the chaos, he launched a counterattack against the Dutch forward, killing 60 or 70 people, and then did not look back. The ground fled towards the southwest. Bronckhorst was initially worried about an ambush by the French army and waited for several hours before finally confirming that the enemy was really gone. Angrily, he sent cavalry to pursue them, but they encountered the French infantry line that had been prepared and had to retreat hastily. Bronckhorst then ordered his men to count the losses and was relieved to learn that the casualties were less than 100. Plus some food and tents had been lost. He looked at his pocket watch. After all the trouble just now, it was almost 5 p.m. He looked at the soldiers who had been standing in line formation all day and had no choice but to order the entire army to return to Waterloo town to rest and then continue to Liege at noon tomorrow. On the other hand, Charles II, who was marching quickly, heard that the Dutch army was attacked by the French, and he immediately felt something was wrong. Although Bronkhorst reported that there were only 1,000 French troops, who knew if that was just the vanguard point, he discussed with his staff for a long time, and finally decided cautiously to send an infantry regiment and 3 squadrons of cavalry to Waterloo to meet the Dutch point. As long as his main force could join Blücher, there would be more than enough troops, and there would be no impact if less than 2,000 people were sent point less than half a day after the reinforcement sent by Charles II left. The southern Netherlands in Brussels sent bad news again. The French army suddenly turned around and went back to Antolf Point for a moment. Charles II wanted to rush directly to Liege without hesitation. First annihilate the Austrian army in Rennes, and then go back with Blücher to deal with the damn French point. But he knew that the French didn't care about the life or death of the Austrian army, but he had to care about the survival of the southern Netherlands Parliament point. After cursing for more than 10 minutes, he ordered the Hanover army to turn north again and rush back to Antolf Point less than 2 days after his troops set out. The infantry regiment that was previously sent to support the Dutch sent back news that it was ambushed by the French army on the way and lost hundreds of people. Chapter 359 Divide, Intersperse, and Decisive Battle. Aren't the French supposed to be in the direction of Ghent? Why did they suddenly appear from the eastern suburbs of Brussels? Karel II almost broke his riding whip, but had no choice but to send another regiment to meet the ambushed troops, and sent out a large number of hussars to scout in case the main force was also ambushed point after Masson raided the Dutch. He received the order from His Royal Highness the Crown Prince to return north to Antolfo, so he circled around the west side of Waterloo and maneuvered to the north of the Dutch point. Because Bronkhorst was frightened by the previous attack, he ordered to maintain a vigilant formation and move forward carefully. After leaving the town, Masson had already completed a large circle and began to send out cavalry to scout the Dutch's position. The Dutch army had just walked less than 8 kilometers northwest of Brussels, next to a small village more than 20 kilometers away from Antolfo. The Guards Corps is resting and recuperating point. They have been marching for 2 consecutive days, covering nearly 60 kilometers. According to Karel II's marching speed, it would take about another day and a half to get here. Point in fact, if Joseph really wanted to attack Antolfo with the city's defensive strength, it is likely that it would have been occupied by the French army before the Hanover army arrived. Point, but that would mean helping Austria counter the rebellion, which was definitely not the result he wanted. Point in the officer's tent in the middle of the Guards Corps camp, Berthier drew the last circle on the map, wrote a line of notes next to it, put away the pencil, and took a long breath. Point the intelligence reported by the various hussar units was finally summarized. Joseph on the side looked at the long snake formation connected by circles of different sizes on the map and couldn't help but smile with satisfaction. We have at least 3 locations that can be used for insertion. He pointed at several points on the map, but this will also spread our forces. With the communication methods of the 18th century, the scattered legions could basically be left to their commanders' free will. However, with the current depth of the senior officer pool of the Guards Corps, Joseph really could not rest assured. Yes, Your Highness. Berthier nodded, and after thinking for a while, he pointed to the southeast of Antolfo, where the main force of Karel II was located. There is an obvious disconnect between the artillery and infantry of the Hanovers. Northeast of Brussels, the strength of about 3 regiments was also dispersed in this direction. Perhaps we can cut between their rear group and this scattered legion, and at the same time, separate the assault force to block their main force in the northwest. In this way, the distance between our 2 intersecting legions will not be too far, which is convenient for command, and can support each other. Joseph carefully looked at the enemy's position on the map and nodded with deep understanding. Point, although he himself had the advanced tactical ideas of later generations, when it came to specific combat deployments, officers like Berthier, who had a professional background and had been immersed in the army for more than 10 years, were more professional. Point, he immediately summoned all the staff members of the staff department and officers at the regimental commander level, and based on Berthier's ideas, he quickly formulated a detailed combat plan. The Guards Corps, which had just rested for half a day, began to march again. But this is nothing to them. When they were in the police academy, they often practiced for a week in a row. The final exercises at the end of each year would even last for more than half a month, during which almost all of them were high-intensity marches. Speed is the basis of roundabout tactics. Therefore, even if the commander of another army on the continent has systematically learned the roundabout tactics, he will be frustrated to find that he cannot implement them at all. His troops have nothing to do from gathering to reaction. From physical strength to morale, it is possible to support such high-intensity mobile operations, and if you don't move as fast as the enemy, you won't be able to disrupt the enemy's deployment and find opportunities. At noon the next day, the Guards Corps marched 30 kilometers in a hurry, and arrived southeast of Antolfo Point. At this time, Carol II was still busy on his way, preparing to enter Antolfo garrison, to resist the French army's attack on the city point. After the Guards Corps rested in place for 2 hours, they began to launch a general attack on the Hanover army, which was in disarray. First, the main force of the entire army quickly cut in from the northwest, separating the legions sent by Carol II to reinforce the Dutch and the main force of the Hanover army. At this point, Carol II was shocked to realize that tens of thousands of French troops were less than 6 kilometers away from him. And the distance between the head and tail of his troops was more than 5 kilometers. Are these Frenchies growing out of the ground? He wiped the sweat from his forehead with the lace of his cuffs, tried to calm down, pointed at a tall officer, and said loudly, "Lieutenant Colonel Schmidt, immediately lead the dragoons to the village of Ogchena to set up a defense line. No one is allowed to take a step back without my order." "Yes, Marshal." Lieutenant Colonel Schmidt turned around and suddenly became bitter. There were less than 2 regiments of dragoons. How could they be the opponent of the main force of the French army in such a hurry? This was obviously to delay the French army with the lives of his soldiers. Immediately, Carol II ordered 2 infantry regiments to pick up the baggage vehicles and artillery of the rear team, and the rest of the troops immediately moved closer to him. At this time, he still had about 16,000 troops in his hands. As long as he could complete the formation, he could still compete with the French army. The 6,000 strong Southern Netherlands army in Brussels will be able to come for reinforcement tomorrow afternoon, and can even launch a counterattack against the French army by then. However, the development of the battlefield situation was completely different from what he had imagined. It took only over an hour for the cavalry artillery of the Guards Corps and the Dragoon Regiment responsible for covering them to cut into the nearly 2-kilometer gap between the main force of the Hanoverian army and the rear artillery. Later, under Napoleon's suggestion, the artillery battalion quickly set up positions on the hills in the north, and the Dragoon Regiment formed an infantry line next to the bushes below the hills. At the same time, the main force of the Guards Corps launched a strong attack on the 3 regiments of the Hanoverian army scattered outside using the absolute advantage in manpower. The 4 infantry regiments on the front attacked in a column formation, and the cavalry surrounded them from both wings. This team of Hanoverian army was still on the march an hour ago, and it was not until they were notified by the herald sent by Carol II that they knew they were going to fight a decisive battle with the French army. Carol II's order to them was to try to get closer to the main force, and not to worry about the Dutch. But before they closed their formation, the French queue appeared in their sight. There was no suspense in the battle. The cavalry of the Guards Corps made a feint attack to contain the enemy, and the frontal infantry had already rushed into the face of the Hanoverians. The column quickly deployed into a line formation, and before a volley was fired, the Hanoverian army was shocked by the terrifying momentum, and began to disintegrate. Chapter 360 Cavalry Artillery shows its power again. The Guards Corps still maintained a strict formation, firing 3 rows of rounds quickly, while the formation continued to move forward. Under this powerful attack, that was as efficient and precise as a machine, the infantry line, that the Hanoverian army barely arranged, was finally cut into 3 parts on the 1-kilometer wide battlefield. Every few minutes, a piece of Hanoverian soldiers would ignore the officer's obstruction. throw down their weapons and turn around to flee. Soon, even the officers began to run away. The infantry line behind the guards corps had not yet pressed forward when they heard the change in the sound of the military drums, and immediately changed their formation and outflanked from both sides. Murat heard from afar that the drums on the enemy side became chaotic and then intermittent, and he was immediately excited. That meant that there was a problem with the enemy's defense line. Sure enough, the battalion commander's order came. The cavalry battalion lined up and chased the defeated enemy. Murat squeezed the horse's belly hard, waved his hands excitedly and shouted, "Gentlemen, it's our turn." It is completely different from the scenes often seen in later TV dramas, where cavalrymen braved the enemy's fierce firepower and rushed into the enemy's formation to kill people. In the long history of human warfare, the main tasks of cavalry are harassment, containment, cover, and pursuit. Use expensive cavalry to attack head-on, unless it is confirmed that the enemy is weak, or the side is on the verge of defeat, and has to fight desperately. So Murat circled the Hanoverian several times before, and didn't even draw his saber. Now he finally has a chance to win military merit. In the last battle, he was promoted to sergeant for bravely breaking through the enemy's formation. If he can kill a few more enemy soldiers this time, he will be a lieutenant when he returns. Soon, the red uniforms of Hanoverian soldiers can be seen all over the ground in the distance. Murat's Arabian warhorse carried him like a wild bull into the red crowd. On the north side of the village of Ogchena, a cavalryman was reporting to the commander of the cavalry artillery battalion, Lacoste, 2 regiments of Hanoverian infantry have arrived 2 kilometers to the northwest. Lacoste looked at his staff and smiled. "If they don't come again, I plan to take a nap first." The staff also smiled. "We have been waiting for more than 40 minutes. The Hanoverians are really slow." Lacoste looked into the distance. "Order everyone to adjust the artillery position and hit the enemy head on. As long as we block the enemy reinforcement for 3 hours, our cavalry can destroy their artillery and baggage." Yes, according to the deployment of the staff, half of the main force of the Guards Corps cavalry was rushing towards the Hanoverian rear team on the east side. Soon, the cannons on the hills roared, and more than a dozen shells whizzed through the Hanoverian army. However, the distance was far, and only 2 hit the target. Even so, the Hanoverians were still horrified. They quickly retreated hundreds of meters, sent scouts to carefully confirm the location of the French artillery, and then hastily organized a skirmisher column to prepare to attack the artillery position. However, they immediately encountered the infantry line of the French dragoons below the hill. The skirmishers' footsteps were blocked by the infantry line, and the shells kept falling from their heads. The Hanoverians' first assault attempt immediately failed. Lacoste held the telescope and watched the enemy retreat like a tide with satisfaction. He had held on for more than an hour. At the current pace, he only needed to drag it out for 3 hours. At this moment, a signalman trotted up to him, raised his hat and saluted, saying, "Commander, Major Buvanaba has some tactical suggestions to report to you." Oh. The artillery battalion commander knew that this young Corsican officer had a very flexible mind, so he nodded curiously. "Please tell me." Half an hour later, the Hanoverians reorganized their ranks. This time they honestly arranged the infantry line and prepared to fight the French army. However, the Hanoverian hussars in the distance suddenly issued a rapid warning. Then the Hanoverian commander saw in the telescope that a group of French cavalry, no, they were still dragging cannons, they should be cavalry artillery, rushed straight to their left wing and began to unload the cannons. "Ah, these French guys crazy." The corner of his eye twitched, and he immediately ordered the organization of skirmishers to destroy those cannons. He only brought 2 regiments of infantry to reinforce the rear team, and there were not enough cavalry to deal with the cannons. However, before the Hanoverian skirmishers were ready, the French cannons had already completed more than 10 volleys, harnessed their horses, and sped away. The Hanoverian commander almost gnashed his teeth and roared to order the infantry line to launch a frontal attack. The right wing heard the warning whistle of the hussars again. Southwest of Ogchena village. Joseph looked at the red soldiers on the roof of the farmhouse in the distance with a telescope and frowned. The Hanoverians were very smart. They should have expected that they could not fight the Guards Corps head on, so they only lined up 2 sparse infantry lines on both sides of the village and scattered nearly half of the soldiers in the village. trying to delay the French army with street fighting. The Guards Corps had just annihilated the 3 Hanoverian regiments that were left alone, and they were rushing towards the main force of Charles II without stopping. At this time, their physical strength was greatly consumed. With this increase and decrease, if they rushed into this small village, they would probably suffer very heavy casualties. Berthier, who was standing by, had obviously noticed this problem as well, and came over to suggest, "Your Highness, perhaps we should go around the village from the west." Joseph hesitated. He clearly remembered that he had seen on the map that there was a small river to the west of the village point, so the detour not only requires walking a few more kilometers, but also wastes a lot of time crossing the river in this way. Carol II is likely to gather his troops, turning the interspersed and divided battle into a head-on confrontation. Although a large part of Hanover's army had been eaten up by this time, and the artillery was lagging behind, there were still tens of thousands of troops left. As for going around the east side of the village, Hanover's main force is on the northwest side, which would increase the distance by more than 10 kilometers. It would be better to cross the river. Just as Joseph and Berthier were weighing the pros and cons, they suddenly heard the faint sound of artillery coming from the north of the village of Ogena. The two looked at each other with doubts on their faces, although it is possible that the main army of Hanover carried some artillery. At this time, the artillery of most European armies was still attached to the infantry. So some light artillery followed the infantry, and was not in the rear of the unified transport, but they were who are they aiming to hit with artillery fire from the north. The Guards Corps is currently on the southwest side of the village. Your Highness, something is wrong. Berthier listened to the sound of cannons and said, "There are at least a dozen cannons. The enemy should not have so many cannons." 20 minutes later, several hussars came to answer his doubts. Report. The cavalry artillery battalion launched an attack on the enemy north of the village of Ogena. Chapter 361 Ransom of 800,000. Joseph and Berthier looked at each other again. Although neither of them understood what was going on, they spoke almost at the same time. "Your Highness, I suggest launching an attack immediately. I think we should cooperate with Major Lacus to launch a strong attack." Berthier then bowed slightly. "Yes, Your Highness." Soon, the scattered soldiers of the guards began to surround the village of Ogena, and at the same time, the cannons roared, tearing the thin infantry lines of the Hanoverian defenders with shells. Berthier looked at Joseph with some worry, and whispered, "Your Highness, is it that the cavalry artillery didn't have time to infiltrate, and the enemy's reinforcement have already joined the rear team?" He frowned again. "Or, they were defeated by the enemy's reinforcement." Joseph thought and shook his head. "At least it's not the latter, otherwise it would be difficult for them to launch such a fierce bombardment." "You just said that there are dozens of cannons shooting at the enemy." Berthier was relieved when he heard it. "You are right. At least they didn't suffer very heavy losses. In this way, even if they didn't have time to stop the Hanoverian reinforcement, they are now in a pincer attack on the village of Ogena with us, which is a good situation." Just as they were talking worriedly, a guard led a burly soldier covered in black smoke. Berthier immediately recognized the man. "Are you Matthew, the messenger of the cavalry artillery battalion?" "Yes, General." "Matthew Dable." The messenger raised his hat and saluted. "The battalion commander heard the sound of artillery firing from your side, so he asked me to come and report to you." The cavalry artillery battalion and the dragoons cooperated to defeat the reinforcement from Hanover to support the rear team. Then the battalion command learned from the prisoners that the enemy had set up defenses in the village of Ogena, so he decided to rush here to attack the enemy. Berthier was stunned for a second, and then he smiled happily. "Major Lacus is really, so brave. He made an outstanding contribution to the victory of the Legion." He looked at Joseph again and whispered, "He used to be a very stable officer." Joseph immediately thought of a certain artillery company commander, curled his lips, and said, "Maybe it was an adventurous subordinate who gave him the idea." The Hanoverian army in Ogena village obviously didn't expect to be attacked from behind, and soon they were in chaos. The commander, Lieutenant Colonel Schmidt, shouted desperately, mobilizing soldiers to the north to stop the enemy, but he had deployed people on the roof before, and it took half an hour to pass the order and organize the team, and less than 3 companies reached the north of the village point and his tossing The Hanoverian soldiers in the village were a little confused, and they all came down from the roof for a while, but heard a louder movement from the south, and hurried back to the roof. North side, the cavalry artillery rushed into the village with almost no one blocking them. Captain Lacoste had the cannons dragged to a few farmhouses less than 100 steps away from the enemy soldiers, and blew them down. The Hanoverian soldiers who saw this scene were so frightened that they left the farmhouses in a hurry, fearing that they would be buried in the ruins like their compatriots on the south side of the village. Dauphin pointed to the burning farmhouse in front and shouted to the herald, "The fire there has destroyed the enemy's defense line. Let's rush over with me." The drummer and the flag bearer carried out the captain's order without hesitation. Under the rapid drum beats, hundreds of guard soldiers quickly passed through the burning farmhouse on both sides. Although the flames licked off all their eyebrows and beards, and even some people's clothes were set on fire, there were indeed no Hanoverian soldiers nearby. Dauphin commanded the soldiers to put out the fire on each other's bodies, simply lined up, and immediately fired at the enemy infantry line on their sides. Then, the gap became larger and larger, and more guard soldiers shouted and poured into the village from their point. Less than an hour later, the guard soldiers who attacked from both the north and south sides met in the village point afterwards. Lieutenant Colonel Schmidt, whose hair was burnt and a large piece of his uniform was torn, was escorted to Joseph by a company commander. After learning of Joseph's identity, the Hanoverian officer politely saluted him on his chest. "I didn't expect that the commander of this army would be the young French crown prince. Your commandant has left me with a very unforgettable impression." Joseph nodded to him and said, "Then, please tell me, how long will it take for His Excellency Carol II to complete the defense line?" "I'm sorry, Your Highness. Out of loyalty to His Majesty the King, I can't say a word to you." Joseph waved his hand, looked at Berthier, and whispered, "What is this person's family background?" The latter thought for a while, and asked the staff officer next to him, and then replied, "Your Highness, Viscount Schmidt is a big family in Verdun. Since the time of George II, his grandfather was a lieutenant general in Hanover." Joseph nodded and smiled. It seems that his family background should be quite rich. So he gestured to the guards next to him. "Please change Viscount Schmidt into neat clothes first, and then invite him to my tent for a cup of tea. Even if it is an enemy, you should give a decent person due respect." Lieutenant Colonel Schmidt was about to express his gratitude, but he heard the French crown prince continue, "The ransom is set at 800,000 livres, which should be able to show your noble status." Schmidt almost vomited blood. It was the first time he heard of a prisoner being priced on the spot. 800,000 livres, that's more than 300,000 florins. He couldn't come up with that much money, even if he sold all his property. "Your Highness, you can't." He was about to bargain when he heard the French crown prince whisper to the general beside him, "Ah, a lot. No, I heard that it is easy for senior officers to get loans from British banks." All his words were stuck in his throat until a French officer asked him to move to the military tent. Carol II asked his staff almost every half an hour, "How long will it take for the army to complete the assembly?" This time, the staff did not report the positions of the troops as before, but whispered with a dark face, "Marshal, I just received news that the village of Ogchina has been breached." Carol II felt dizzy. It was less than 4 hours, and Schmidt, who was very good at defensive battles, was defeated. In other words, there was only less than 3 miles of open road between the French army and himself. He looked at the map on the side. At this time, the farthest infantry regiment on his side was still 1.5 miles away. When the French launched the attack, they might not be able to complete the assembly point, and the most fatal thing was that there was no news from the artillery of the rear team point. If there were no cannons, even if he fought the French army head on, he would only be beaten up in the end. He hesitated for a long time, called an officer not far away, and said loudly, "Sir Dill, you are now in full command of the army." Chapter 362. Good news continues. On a high ground 2 kilometers away from the main force of the Hanoverian army, there is a small wooden table with 2 cups of hot tea on it. Joseph picked up the cup without any additions, gestured to Berthier across the table, and then took a sip comfortably. "There are so many good news today." The latter smiled and nodded. "Yes, Your Highness." I didn't expect that the Hanoverian artillery forgot to destroy the cannons in a hurry. We can even drag the 16 guns directly to the front of Hanover's defense line to double the firepower. Just now, the Guards cavalry battalion sent back news that they easily wiped out the rear of the Hanoverian army, which lacked infantry cover. The Hanoverians obviously did not expect the French army to come so quickly, and they fled without any decent resistance point. Of course, they could not run faster than the Hussars in more than 2 hours. The 3rd Cavalry Battalion of the Guards captured more than 800 Hanoverian soldiers, seized all of their 16 cannons, and a large amount of logistical supplies. As Berthier said, the Hanoverian soldiers were so panicked that they even forgot to set fire to the baggage and mail the gun ports. The French cavalry drove more than 80 carts still harnessed to horses and returned to the camp happily. As the two were talking, a staff officer walked over quickly, raised his hat and saluted. "Your Highness, General, our army has broken through the left wing of the enemy's infantry line." Berthier showed a happy expression and turned to look through the telescope, but he found nothing because of the thick smoke on the battlefield. He had to turn back and lie on the map to identify the breakthrough location. "It's here." The staff officer pointed to the north side of a small river. "Great," Berthier said excitedly. "If the two skirmisher companies on the right wing cooperate with the 10th Infantry Regiment to penetrate westward, we can form an encirclement of the enemy. Oh, let the cavalry artillery maneuver to the left side of the enemy's line and drive them south. We can ensure that all enemies are surrounded." Joseph looked at the map and saw that the front and northeast side of the Hanover infantry line, which was 2 kilometers long and spread along the river valley, gathered 6 regiments of the Guards Corps infantry. At the same time, more than a dozen cannons were bombarding them on the high ground on the east side point. If the troops were mobilized as Berthier said, the Hanover army would have no way out except jumping into the river in the south, and would basically be annihilated. The staff officer was about to give an order to the herald, but heard His Royal Highness the Crown Prince say, "No, please maintain the current situation. Order the troops to focus on destroying the enemy's cavalry and leave them room to retreat to Brussels." Berthier looked at Joseph in surprise. "Your Highness, this is a good opportunity to annihilate the enemy. Why do you want to?" "This is based on political considerations, General. I will explain it to you later." Although Joseph smiled, his tone was unquestionable. "Now, please do as I say." "Just kidding. This Hanoverian army is a treasure. As long as they are there, Austria trapped in Silesia cannot do without France. Now that the Hanoverians have lost all their artillery, if the cavalry is also annihilated in large numbers, coupled with the heavy blow to their morale in this battle, they will hardly pose any threat to the Guards Corps in the future. After receiving all the rewards that should be collected, they can be eaten at any time. Berthier confirmed with Joseph again whether he really wanted to let the enemy go. After receiving a positive answer, although he was full of doubts, he still ordered the messenger to do so. Today seemed destined to be a day to receive good news. About an hour later, a messenger from the front line came to the temporary command post and excitedly reported to Joseph, "Your Highness, just now the enemy commander General Deal sent someone to express his willingness to surrender." "What?" Joseph's face suddenly darkened. "Do you want to be so useless?" Exclamation mark. "I don't even surround you. Don't you know to run away with such a big gap on the northwest side? George III is going to lose face for you." Actually, it can't be blamed entirely on General Deal. Just now, his main cavalry was chased into a valley and couldn't come back. Without the cover of cavalry, he didn't know whether he would be chased by the French cavalry and collect heads after turning around and running away. Anyway, he was ordered to do it in a critical situation, and Charles II would be responsible if he surrendered. So he chose the safest way to deal with it: surrender. Joseph looked at the herald beside him and said in a deep voice, "How could the brave and fearless Hanoverian army surrender? This must be their conspiracy to trick our army into relaxing its vigilance. Send that guy who pretended to surrender back and tell his commander that we will never be fooled." This. Several officers looked at each other in surprise. Berthier was the first to react and leaned into Joseph's ear and said, "Your Highness, is this also a political consideration?" "Yes." Soon, General Dill, who had no way to surrender, had to take the risk of fleeing to Brussels under the continuous fierce attack of the Guards. After receiving the latest report on the battle, Joseph finally breathed a sigh of relief and ordered the cavalry, who had worked hard for a day, to rest on the spot, and the infantry to pursue cautiously and not to enter the suburbs of Brussels. The city of Brussels is already the Flemish region, which is not France's current strategic goal. Young men, do you still have the energy to teach the Dutch a lesson? Masson smiled and shouted to the soldiers sitting on the ground point. In response, he was shouted with great momentum, "Yes, Commander, this is much easier than the usual training. Enough for a quick march to Amsterdam." Haha. Masson nodded with satisfaction and said a few more words to boost morale. He was about to order the final round of attack on Bronkhorst. In the past few days, the Dutch were cut into 3 pieces by him, and more than 1,400 people had been killed or captured. At this time, Bronkhorst was desperately rushing towards Brussels, trying to get the protection of the Hanoverians, but their ranks became extremely messy in a hurry, making them very easy to attack. Point at this moment, a hussar came quickly and reported to Masson, "Commander, we found a small group of Hanoverian troops near the dense forest on the north side. Judging from their clothes, there seem to be several high-ranking officers." "Oh, Hanoverian?" Masson narrowed his eyes. According to the information sent by the staff, the main force of Hanoverian troops should be dozens of kilometers away to the east. "How come officers came here?" he hurriedly asked the hussar. "How many people are there?" "No, more than 400, Commander." Masson looked to the southwest again, where there were nearly 2,000 Dutch troops, and looked to the north, where there were Hanoverian officers approaching inexplicably. Finally, his eyes stopped at the north. Chapter 363. The situation Joseph needs. Joseph looked at the report on the seized supplies and couldn't help but smile with satisfaction. This battle encountered almost no decent resistance from the Hanoverians, mainly because the previous detours had messed up their deployment and they couldn't organize a decent battle at all, and left nearly half of the logistical supplies, saving at least 1,000,000 livres for the Guards Corps. And those British cannons are also treasures, and they are very useful for assisting those forces that are not suitable for publicity, such as Poland. People will not associate it with France. In addition, several Hanoverian officers were captured, and Joseph was thinking about whether he could squeeze out a ransom of 2 or 3 million livres. Of course, this was his asking price, and those nobles in North Germany might not be able to pay it. "Your Highness, good news." The voice of the staff came from behind. Joseph, Berthier and others turned around and saw the corps staff officer rushing over with a messenger, smiling and shouting. Major Masson accidentally encountered the guards of Charles II and successfully captured Charles II. Everyone immediately burst into admiration and cheers. Only Joseph stood there, like he was struck by lightning, unable to say a word for a long time. My dear battalion commander Masson, are you so brave? I tried my best to let the main force of Hanover run away, but you captured their commander. Charles II is still the governor of Hanover, so Hanover will most likely withdraw from the war in the southern Netherlands. The Austrians must be happy. Blücher can't do it alone, and the southern Netherlands will soon restore Austrian rule. Although Charles II is the governor of Hanover and the brother-in-law of the King of England, the ransom will definitely be sky high. But after all, Wallonia is more valuable. Joseph quickly made up his mind, called the captain of the guard, Exode, to his side, and whispered a few words. The latter stepped back half a step, and looked at the crown prince in surprise, but did not ask anything, just bowed and replied, "Yes, your highness." The camp of the Masson Corps. Exode first read out the crown prince's commendation for the entire camp and the promotion decision of many meritorious personnel, and then pulled Masson into the military tent. "What did you say? How can this be?" Masson exclaimed in the tent. But he calmed down after seeing the handwritten letter from His Royal Highness the Crown Prince, and then whispered, "Yes, I understand." At night, a team of southern Netherlands rebels from Wallonia sneaked into the camp of the Masson Corps. After quietly killing more than a dozen French guards, they accidentally discovered the imprisoned Charles II. The French-speaking rebels rescued the governor of Hanover and others from the enemy camp, helped them onto the stolen horses, and bravely stayed behind to snipe the pursuers. When Carol II heard the gunshots in the night sky, he couldn't bear to look back, and repeated in his heart the last words those warriors said to him. "Please help the rebels drive away the Austrians. We are watching you in heaven." Brussels. In the hall on the first floor of the Southern Netherlands Parliament building, dozens of parliamentarians sat or stood with wooden expressions, as if their souls had been taken away by the devil, and sighed anxiously from time to time. Suddenly a soldier pushed the door open and shouted, "Marshal Carol II is back, and General Bronkhorst." All the parliamentarians' eyes suddenly lit up, and Van der Not rushed to the door in a few steps and asked anxiously, "Really? Where are they?" "In the south of the city." Carol II didn't even change his military uniform, that was torn in many places, and went straight to his army station. When Van der Not and other parliamentarians arrived, he was giving an excited speech to the Hanoverian soldiers. "We are not afraid of failure. We want to let the French and Austrians know that they only won once by luck. Prussia and Britain will send more reinforcement, and our army will roll over Luxembourg until they step into France." Bronkhorst on the side also echoed loudly, "The Netherlands will also increase its troops. The southern Netherlands will be independent." Although the soldiers below were not moved by their enthusiasm, Van der Not and others were extremely excited, and immediately followed suit, and said that they would recruit more southern Dutch people to join the battle. Immediately, Carol II summoned senior officers from Hanover, the Netherlands and the southern Netherlands, and deployed the defense of Brussels as quickly as possible. The French and Austrian coalition forces will definitely take advantage of the victory to attack Brussels, and they must stop this wave. In the afternoon, more than 13,000 Hanoverian soldiers who escaped, plus 3,000 Dutch soldiers, and more than 18,000 Southern Netherlands National Guards quickly built several lines of defense in the south of the city, ready for battle. However, the French army did not lazily launch a round of attacks on Brussels until 3 days later, and immediately retreated, after being blocked. For a period of time afterwards, the two sides used the southern suburbs of Brussels as the dividing line, deployed their troops in a range of 7 or 8 kilometers wide, and formed a confrontation. The French army would fire a burst of artillery at the defenders every day, and sometimes the cavalry would circle around a distance, making the defenders nervous. Brussels front. Guards Corps Camp. Joseph looked at the movement of Blücher's corps on the map, and couldn't help frowning slightly. "Do the Prussians seem to want to retreat?" "We think so too, Your Highness." Berthier nodded. "After all, their position in Liege is very unfavorable. If our army abandons Brussels and turns south, we can form a pincer attack on the Prussian army with General Leo." Joseph immediately pointed to the Meuse River on the north side of Liege and ordered, "Let Lieutenant Colonel Lefebvre stop the Prussians here. They must be kept in Liege, but don't fight them." "Yes, Your Highness." After the messenger left, Joseph thought for a while, and looked at Berthier. "Do you know who is the most radical among the Prussian senior officials?" The latter thought for a while and said, "Your Highness, it should be Morendorf and Driesen." Joseph nodded and wrote it down, asking the staff to discuss the detailed plan to intercept the Prussian army. He went to the officer's tent and wrote a letter to the French diplomatic officials on the Prussian side. Blücher's army also played an important role, which was to delay the Austrian army in the southern Netherlands. Once the Prussians retreat, Rennes will certainly come to participate in the confrontation in Brussels. In that case, the military presence in Wallonia will not only be the French army, which will have a very adverse impact on Joseph's subsequent strategy. After handing the letter to the messenger, Joseph took out the half-written letter to the Holy Roman Emperor Joseph II, and continued to write, "Dear uncle, you should have learned about the situation in the southern Netherlands after suffering heavy casualties and extremely difficult battles. The French warriors finally stopped the rebels in the Brussels area. You know, including the Hanoverians and the Dutch, there are more than 35,000 enemy troops gathered in front of our army, which has put us under great pressure." Chapter 364 From Austria to Russia. Joseph would certainly not tell the Holy Roman Emperor that among the enemy troops in Brussels, there were more than 18,000 southern Netherlands troops with little combat effectiveness, including the remnants of whose morale had collapsed after being beaten by the Guards Corps, as well as farmers and vendors who were temporarily recruited. Even the Dutch army was recruited during the uprising last year, and their combat effectiveness was basically not good. The only ones who could really fight were the 13,000 people in Hanover, and there were no cavalry or artillery. But the total number of 35,000 was all under the name of Charles II, which was enough to scare people. Joseph's pen was still moving on the letter paper. In order to prevent the southern Netherlands from falling into the hands of the rebels again, you need to send at least 20,000 soldiers here. And Prussia and Hanover may also send reinforcement here, so you'd better mobilize more troops to be safe. Oh, there is another very important thing, dear uncle. Due to the threat of the Prussian army in the direction of Liege, our army's logistics supply has encountered great trouble. You know, vehicles transported from Luxembourg to Brussels must pass near Liege. This makes our army's logistics very vulnerable to attack. So I hope to collect military supplies locally in the southern Netherlands, which can also save you some expenses. A large part of the French army's current military expenditure in the southern Netherlands is paid by Austria. And if the French army can collect supplies locally, it is equivalent to taking over the taxation of the southern Netherlands. At the same time, some management positions must be set up to facilitate communication with the people and the transportation of supplies. As for some incompetent Austrian officials, it becomes natural to let them temporarily hand over their powers during the war. At the end of the letter, Joseph said righteously that France would give as much support as possible to Austria, including the preparation of sending more troops to the Brussels front. So please rest assured, His Majesty. He knew very well that Austria and Prussia were fighting fiercely in Silesia at the moment, and anyone who dared to take a step back would have devastating consequences. So Joseph II wanted to transfer the Austrian army in the southern Netherlands back, and it was absolutely impossible to send another 20,000 soldiers here. Then Austria had only two choices left. 1. Lose the southern Netherlands. 2. Export benefits to France and let the French army help stabilize the situation in the southern Netherlands. In fact, it was equivalent to having no choice. If the southern Netherlands became independent, not only would the empire lose face and morale suffer a heavy blow, but the southern Netherlands National Guard and the Dutch army would probably go to Silesia to reinforce the Prussians. With this, Austria would not have to fight this war. Joseph handed the letter to the messenger and summoned a staff officer to go to Luxembourg to pass a message to the Austrian commander Leo. As soon as he finished his work, Emin entered the tent with the messenger from Paris. The latter saluted Joseph respectfully and then took out two letters from his suitcase and handed them to Emin beside him. Joseph took the letter from the attendant and read it carefully. One was sent by Archbishop Brian, and it should be, to seek the opinion of His Royal Highness the Crown Prince on important matters that have happened in France recently, which is actually a work report. The other one was written by Queen Mary, and it was also attached with a plan to promote Russian-French trade submitted by the Russian ambassador. He opened his mother's letter first, confused. The first paragraph was as usual, saying that she missed her son so much that she had a headache, and then she was concerned about whether her son had eaten well in Luxembourg, whether he was sick, whether he was tired, and scolded him for forgetting to bring a cook. Joseph felt the deep love in the letter, and his heart was warm. It seems that when my mother wrote the letter, I was still in Luxembourg, but it's just that it's no big deal to bring a few royal chefs to fight on the front line. They usually bring a few carts of kitchen utensils and ingredients. Joseph suddenly thought that he could let the royal chefs cook nutritious meals for the wounded in the rear. On the one hand, the soldiers can feel the care and attention of the royal family, and on the other hand, my mother doesn't have to nag me about this every time. He continued to look down. Queen Mary told her son not to get too close to the front line in the letter, and let the generals take care of the war. There are so many generals in France. Joseph couldn't help but sigh. In his mother's eyes, anyone is always just a fragile child. Well, in this case, just give me the rank of general. He curled his lips and turned to the second page of the letter. After Queen Mary finished her chatter, she mentioned an interesting thing she had encountered not long ago. Count Stroganov, the Russian ambassador to France, was obviously drunk and said that their emperor admired France's Swedish plan and supported our claim to the Low Countries. In the end, Stroganov even said that, as long as the Russian army could cross Poland and support us to seize the Rhine River on the east side of Austria. Look at what he said. But he is an excellent diplomat after all. Even after drinking so much, he can still speak clearly. Joseph couldn't help but narrow his eyes slightly when he saw this. The Swedish plan was proposed by him personally, and let Talleyrand use it to fool the Russians. This was obviously Catherine II's response to France, and it was definitely not, because the Russian ambassador was drunk. What he didn't expect was that Ulrika's appetite was so big that he not only wanted Sweden and Poland, but also wanted to divide Germany with France. She really deserved to be the most courageous woman in the late 18th century. To be honest, Joseph was even moved by Ulrika's proposal for a few seconds. If France gets all the rich lands in Western Europe west of the Rhine, including the Netherlands and Belgium, it will definitely get Italy as well. If Austria has no time to take care of itself, weak Italy will be a piece of meat for France. Then France it will surely soar into the sky and become the true overlord of the European continent. However, he quickly calmed down and shook his head away from these unrealistic thoughts. Ulrika obviously wanted France to attract firepower to facilitate Russia's expansion. Look at the places Russia wants: Sweden, Poland, and even the northeastern Balkans. These are places far away from the core area of Europe. Even if it takes it, Britain, Prussia, Austria, the Netherlands, Spain and other European countries. Even if major countries are unhappy, they may not choose to intervene due to cost factors. As for the benefits allocated to France by Ulrika, whether in the Low Countries or along the Rhine River, these are the lungs of the European powers. They will definitely use all their national strength to fight against France. Joseph grabbed the messenger and asked in a deep voice, "How did Her Majesty the Queen reply to the Russian ambassador?" The latter only said that Count Bobulensky and Grand Duchess Alexandra were also present that day. As for what they said, he did not know at all. It's no wonder that, in order to keep it secret, Stroganov carefully avoided all formal occasions, even balls, and chose to have a close discussion with Queen Mary at the art exhibition, just to avoid being overheard. Joseph shook his head and sighed. Catherine II sent her illegitimate son and granddaughter, which showed that she really wanted to facilitate this matter, although judging from the tone of my mother's letter, she was just talking nonsense as the Russian ambassador, and she probably didn't agree, but I was afraid that she would suddenly become hot-headed. Joseph hurriedly wrote a reply to Queen Mary, mainly asking her not to reply to the Russians. Then he gave it to the messenger and ordered him to send it back to Versailles as quickly as possible. Looking at the back of the messenger, Joseph couldn't help but fall into deep thought. It seemed that he had to communicate with his mother in advance about national strategic matters in the future. Otherwise it would be troublesome to clean up if there was a big mess. He immediately thought that, although Ulrika's suggestion could not be agreed, she could use her ambition to seek strategic interests for France. It's just that you have to think carefully about how to operate it. Joseph picked up the plan for promoting Russian-French trade on the table. The main content was that Ulrika hoped to further increase Russian-French trade to reduce dependence on British trade. Apparently the rising trade volume of Twin Trading Company recently aroused her interest. Joseph couldn't help but shook his head slightly when he saw the unoriginal clauses on the document. France's current demand for raw materials is only that large, and the Russian market cannot be completely open to France, so the current transaction volume between the two parties has basically reached saturation. Russia does have a lot of coal and iron resources, but it is too far from France and the transportation cost is very high. Otherwise, it can be purchased in large quantities. He was about to throw the document aside, but suddenly thought of something and couldn't help but whisper to himself, "No, the transportation cost is high, then localization can be carried out." He immediately recalled the British business case in Russia in the 19th century. At that time, Russia failed in the Crimean War, and the Tsar realized the importance of the steel industry and the urgency of developing the areas adjacent to Crimea. At this time, there was a British entrepreneur named John Huss. Because it was too hard to work in the UK, he wanted to try his luck in Russia. As a result, he noticed that the Donbas region north of Crimea is extremely rich in coal and iron resources, but it has not been effectively exploited at all. So he signed a contract with the Tsarist government, invested a sum of money in Donbas, and personally brought more than 100 British workers here to open mines and build factories at a time when Russia was vigorously building its Baltic fleet, whose ironworks continuously sold steel to Russian shipyards and made a lot of money, and eventually expanded his ironworks into a sizable city. It wasn't until nearly a century later, when the October fortune-telling broke out, that whose investment myth finally came to an end point, and the current coal and iron resources have not even been explored in the Donbas region. If you invest at this time, the cost will definitely be lower than that of whose. It is estimated that for the price of buying wasteland, you can buy high quality coal and iron ore. Then a factory was built locally to mine, and the refined crude ingots were transported back to France for refining. Unused coal can be burned into coke and shipped back to France, or even sold locally to make money. The factory employed Russians, and no matter how poor the wages were, there was no need to worry about them causing trouble. The Tsar was never merciful to those who made trouble in his own country. Of course, iron smelting plants in Russia can only use older technologies to prevent the rapid improvement of Russia's industrial level. Simply a huge profit. Moreover, the completion of mining and factories can also increase Russia's tax revenue and help build the rear of Crimea. Crimea is Russia's most important port, allowing Russia to have a maritime trade channel with the European continent. Successive Tsars have attached great importance to it. However, it was not until Catherine II defeated Osman that she completely controlled the outlet of the Black Sea. If France can help Russia stabilize its rule over Crimea, building surrounding cities and attracting more people to settle is the best way to rule, then Yika will definitely be grateful to France. Historically, the Tsar has always maintained a protective attitude towards whose investment, which is enough to explain the problem. Joseph's mouth flashed a smile. In this case, he had to ask Catherine II for something, otherwise she might feel guilty. So he picked up a pen and wrote at the back of the trade plan document, "France appreciates and supports the terms of the above plan." At the same time, in order to promote the traditional friendship between Russia and France, France decided to propose that its investors and factory owners go to the Crimea area for construction. Only investment, no political or military content, and comply with Russian tax and trade laws. I hope His Majesty the Tsar can provide appropriate assistance to France on matters related to North Africa after dealing with the Russian affairs. Joseph opened Brian's letter and read it carefully. The Chief Minister first reported the recent general situation in France in the letter and asked His Royal Highness the Crown Prince to make a decision on matters that he could not make up his mind. Then he talked about the huge expenses of recent foreign military operations. Due to various unforeseen circumstances, the overall expenditure was 12% higher than expected, but it was still within the financial system's tolerance range for the time being. However, if the war continues, it is expected that the finances will have problems by the end of the year at most. This was not beyond Joseph's expectations, but he did not plan to wage foreign wars for a long time. At least in North Africa, there should be a turnaround soon, and the local tax revenue in the southern Netherlands will relieve a large part of the financial pressure. Overall, it is within controllable range. He continued to look down. In the last part of the letter, Brian reported the latest plan for farmers to redeem land discussed at the cabinet meeting. Joseph frowned subconsciously. This redemption plan has been revised 3 times, but none of them are satisfactory. Yes, although he had promoted the abolition of the feudal privileges of the French nobility before, the policy on how farmers can redeem land has not yet been announced. So for the farmers, they were only exempted from some small taxes such as mill taxes, oven taxes, and hunting taxes. The core land issue has not yet been truly implemented, which is also the core reason why they were not very enthusiastic about the abolition of feudal privileges before. However, how to redeem the land is an extremely tricky matter, and it will definitely affect the entire country. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story, and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 365, The Counterattack of the Indian Natives. Joseph began to carefully read the land redemption plan submitted by Brian. At the beginning of the document, it was first stated that the public land illegally occupied by the nobles must be returned free of charge. Joseph could not help but nod slightly. This version is finally an improvement over the previous one. In the feudal era, the ownership of land in France was very chaotic, and almost no one could absolutely own a piece of land. A large amount of feudal land was jointly owned by the king, nobles, churches, and local governments, or in other words, it belonged to no one. In addition, the right to occupy, use, and income of land usually belonged to different people. The feudal lords were not actually the owners of the land, but they had the right to collect taxes and the power to designate cultivators. Of course, the king also had some right to collect taxes. Many of these lands belonged to public lands, such as forests, ponds, wastelands, etc., which usually accounted for half of all the land in a village. According to regulations, farmers can mow grass, chop wood, and graze on these public lands, and nobles can hunt here. However, after hundreds of years of evolution, the nobles relied on their power to occupy these public lands, turning them into their own hunting grounds, summer resorts, fish ponds, or reclaiming wasteland for farming, and levied taxes on these illegally occupied lands in the first two versions of the land plan. The public lands occupied by the nobles were converted in proportion and allowed to be redeemed by farmers. The reason was that the nobles had also paid a lot of costs to develop these lands. The latest version of the plan finally forced the nobles to return the public lands. However, Joseph knew that this matter was not that simple. The amount of public land occupied by the nobles was huge, and some not so rich nobles even had to rely on these lands for food. It was definitely not a simple abolition that could solve the problem. The king could issue a decree to reclaim the public lands, but a large number of desperate nobles might also gather together and mess up the country. And the nobles were the most influential people in feudal society. Joseph continued to look at the documents in his hand. Annual tribute, tithes, and other rents and taxes will no longer need to be redeemed. Annual tribute: farmers can pay 25 times the annual output value of the land, and other types of tenants can pay 30 times the annual output value of the land in one lump sum. At the same time, the transfer fee for such redeemed land is 5 times that of normal transactions. In addition, farmers must first pay all the overdue annual tributes and other taxes before they can redeem the land. The document also includes an estimated total amount of land redemption in France, 3.8 to 4 billion livres. Joseph was almost amused. This thing was made by Mirabeau and his group at first glance. The abolition of annual tribute, tithes, and so on was used to disgust the old nobles, because the emerging nobles like them hardly lived on these feudal rents and taxes, and a one-time redemption fee of 25 to 30 times the annual output value of the land is something that ordinary tenants can't afford. Looking at the total amount of 4 billion livres, you can see that if French farmers can come up with so much money, there is no need to reform the land system. Who cares about your land ownership when they are so rich? Not to mention the billions of ransom money. In fact, more than half of the French farmers can't even make up for the overdue rent and taxes. In other words, they don't even have the qualifications to participate in the ransom. This ransom plan is obviously prepared for the capitalist aristocrats to merge and speculate on land. Only they can afford such expensive land. After buying the land, they can manipulate the land price and resell it to make a fortune. The farmers still have to rent their land, but it's just that the feudal rent and taxes have changed to the surplus value being exploited by capitalists. Joseph can imagine how disappointed the farmers will be with the royal family after experiencing the excitement of getting rid of the shackles of feudal rent and taxes, and then falling into another heavy exploitation. Yes, the farmers will only blame these problems on the royal family, who makes you the big boss, the biggest target, and the easiest to be targeted. Then it may be that the late big destiny will come as promised. Joseph couldn't help rubbing his eyebrows. Although this version of the land redemption plan has made some progress compared to the previous one, the previous version even required farmers to redeem 30 years of feudal rent and taxes before they could buy land. It will still seriously intensify social contradictions in France. Historically, the fuelants and gerundins would quickly fall, and the fundamental reason was that the land redemption policy was opposed by the whole country. To be honest, Joseph really wants to launch a great revolution now to eliminate the aristocracy, so that he can copy the practice of the Jacobins in history. However, if he launches a great revolution, his family will be in danger first. How to stabilize the aristocracy while reducing the pressure on the lower level farmers to redeem the land as much as possible, and at the same time, take care of the attitude of the capitalist class. He rubbed his hair irritably and started to revise the land redemption plan. The feudal rent and taxes must be partially redeemed, and the way of handling public land is completely unacceptable. This is to take care of the jobs of some old aristocrats. The redemption amount of 25 to 30 times the annual output value of the land is definitely unreasonable, and it is not allowed to be paid in one lump sum. Here, banks can consider providing loans to farmers. The total redemption cost in the country cannot exceed 1.5 billion livres at a minimum per capita guaranteed land area. Before exceeding the minimum guaranteed area, farmers redeem the land at the most favorable price, and the amount of the excess will be gradually increased. In addition, the longer the cultivation time and the higher the per acre yield, the cheaper the land redemption will be. After Joseph finished writing this, he still felt unsatisfied. So he sent the revised document back to Brian, asking the smart people of this era to think of another solution. However, Joseph did not expect that this crack regarding the land redemption policy would soon be targeted by another group of people. London. The British Foreign Secretary, the Marquis Wellesley, came out of the Parliament Hall, got into the carriage with a dark face, and drove straight to number 10 Downing Street. How is the situation? Prime Minister Peter Jr. was obviously waiting for him. He opened the door of his office and welcomed him in. You don't seem to be looking very well. The situation in India is probably far worse than we imagined. Marquis Wellesley hung his hat on a shelf nearby, turned back and closed the door, and said in a deep voice, "When I asked the question in Parliament just now, the Whig Party people say that Missour's army suddenly attacked Cannoneer, and more than 200 East India Company men were captured, and several ships were lost." Little Pete's expression suddenly changed. He first cursed the intelligence system in his mind. He didn't know about such a big thing earlier than the opposition party, and then looked at the foreign secretary. What on earth do those Indian natives want to do? Chapter 366 Battle of Brussels. The Marquis of Wellesley sat down on the chair opposite, recalling the news he had just heard in Parliament. According to Fox, nearly 2 months ago, Mysore sent out 6,000 troops to attack Cannoneer. The defending East India Company soldiers only resisted for 3 days before being completely defeated. Cannoneer is an important stronghold of the East India Company in the southwest of the Indian peninsula. If it is lost, the trade in Southwest India will be greatly affected. Although the East India Company is a company, it is actually the British administrative agency in India. From the government to parliamentarians, from officials to businessmen, almost everyone in the UK has bought shares in the East India Company. It can be said that the company's interests have been damaged, and the impact on the UK is even greater than the government's financial losses. Little Pitt frowned. You mean those Indian natives only invested 5,000 people, although the East India Company's garrison in Cannoneer is less than 600 people. They are basically people with experience in regular military service, and their combat effectiveness is absolutely overwhelming the Indian natives. Moreover, there were thousands of vassal troops recruited from the local area. According to past experience, they could at least resist the fierce attack of tens of thousands of Mysore troops for 1 or 2 months, but this time, they were captured after only 3 days of defense. Marquis Wellesley said solemnly, "It is said that this batch of Mysore troops is extremely powerful, all equipped with flintlock rifles made in Europe, and more than 10 sophisticated cannons. The East India Company's bastions were breached by them with cannons. These sophisticated weapons were naturally brought to Mysore by Lafayette. Moreover, Princess Amira of Tunisia had arrived in Mysore and secretly held an engagement ceremony with Tipu Sultan's son Nawaz. Although the marriage had not been officially completed, her dowry had been shipped to India in advance. It was a complete set of artillery production equipment, 30 cannon casting technicians, and enough raw materials to produce 50 cannons. This means that Tipu Sultan will have a steady supply of cannons. Although the British Navy controlled the shipping in the Indian Ocean, it had no way to take away the smuggling ships. The cannon casting technicians could land safely on French merchant ships. France also had a small colony in Pondicherry, India, maintaining a negligible trade point. Most importantly, Mysore had Lafayette, a general who was good at commanding rookies, to fight point for a country like India, which was still in the middle of feudal society. Only a small part of the factors that restricted the combat effectiveness of the army came from weapons and equipment, and more from various backward systems in the quality of the soldiers. Lafayette led the military reform of Mysore as the protector of Princess Amira and the official rank of Umda. He made strict regulations from the payment of military pay to the appointment and removal of officers, from military discipline to how to coordinate between soldiers of different beliefs, and even as detailed as how to arrange tents when camping, and how many laps to walk in which direction when patrolling point. After nearly 3 months of rigorous training with whips and sticks, this Indian army, which originally had a certain foundation in European drill, was almost reborn. Although the combat effectiveness is still far inferior to that of the British Army, at least it will not be easily beaten 10-1 as before. Point of course, with Lafayette's energy, he only slept 5 hours a day and only trained 4,000 new Mysore troops. The rest had to be trained by the Tunisian officers he brought point in the Battle of the Raidon Cannoneer. He personally led 3,000 new troops, plus 3,000 ordinary Indian soldiers, and easily took over the East India Company's camp point. However, there were also factors that the British did not expect. At that time, only half of the soldiers, that is, 300 people, were on duty in the bastion, and the others were doing business or having fun in nearby cities. And the vassal army was not formally summoned. Point after Lafayette launched the attack, those British vassal troops who had no loyalty at all saw that the Mysore people seemed extremely fierce. Tip's title of the Tiger of Mysore also played a big role, so they turned against him one after another. These people were very familiar with the defense of Cannoneer, which further accelerated the collapse of the British defenders. Marquis Wellesley continued. The last news from India is that more than 10,000 Mysore troops are approaching North Canada. Little Pitt's face was gloomy. North Canada is an important base of the East India Company in Western India, and the port of Malabar is there. If this place is occupied by Mysore again, Britain will not have a single trading base available on the entire west coast of India. And India is a long way from Britain, and this news was at least a month and a half ago. He looked at Marquis Wellesley thoughtfully. It seems that the Royal Navy should give full support to India, and it will also require an expeditionary force of thousands of people. Marquis Wellesley nodded and suddenly remembered something and added, Prime Minister, the Governor General of India Cornwallis once mentioned that a group of French people have been active in Mysore recently. Mysore has set off a wave of hatred against Britain a while ago, and it is very likely that the French are behind it, and the weapons in the hands of the Indians should also be provided by them. Little Pitt was very surprised. France's financial situation should have been very serious, but it could still squeeze out funds to aid the Indians. How could he know that France actually only had Lafayette and a Tunisian princess? The rest of the investment had long been compensated by Tipu Sultan's betrothal gifts, and even made a small profit. Little Pitt sighed silently. He had invested a lot of money in Africa before, but the French still did not withdraw from Tunisia. Then Hanover's army suffered another disastrous defeat in the southern Netherlands. And now India needs a large investment. In addition, Britain's textile exports in Europe have declined recently, and the French are using cheap fabrics to impact Britain's markets in Germany and Spain. If the unfavorable situation everywhere cannot be reversed, the Whigs will definitely take the opportunity to attack, and His Majesty the King may also doubt his ability. He calculated the cost of aiding India in the complicated situation of the war with Mysore, and finally tiredly signaled to the Marquis of Wellesley, please go to Paris as soon as possible. We can't produce greater losses in India. Southern Netherlands. Brussels. Carol II looked at the officers in front of him angrily and shouted, what are you doing? The French only have 3,000 people in Lully, and you have used nearly 3 times the force, and failed to capture it. Several Hanover officers bowed their heads and said nothing, but they were complaining in their hearts those French troops were really too terrible. Before their troops approached the town of Lully, the inferior French army actually took the initiative to attack and split their ranks in 2 points. If they had not reacted quickly and retreated in time, I'm afraid that the loss would not be 300 soldiers. In fact, it was Joseph who strictly ordered not to annihilate the enemy on a large scale. Otherwise, how could they escape from the hands of the Guards? The front line south of Brussels had been in a standoff for more than a month. Charles II recruited more than 7,000 troops from Hanover, but he could not shake the French army at all, but he suffered losses one after another. Chapter 367 Cold Treasure House. What Carol II didn't know was that Joseph had implemented a rotation mode in order to keep the Guard Corps strong in morale. 2 regiments of troops were stationed in 2 important towns south of Brussels, and 1,000 people were left in the middle area for alert. Together with the hussars, who were scattered for reconnaissance, only half of the troops were in combat readiness, and the other half were undergoing daily training in the north of Namur Point every 1.5 months. The 2 sides rotated point. In addition, he also recruited 5,000 locals in Wallonia to form the Wallonia Guard to assist in the war in Brussels. In the French-speaking area of the southern Netherlands, as long as they were given a little military pay, there were a lot of people willing to serve the French Crown Prince. In other words, under the current stalemate, 7,000 Guard Corps soldiers, plus 5,000 temporarily recruited miscellaneous troops, can deal with the 40,000 people with low morale on the opposite side. Carol II recalled the humiliation of being captured and angrily ordered several officers in front of him to go back and organize the troops and then launch an attack on the French army. 3 days later, after the Hanoverian generals left in silence, Carol II gradually calmed down. The French army south of Brussels was extremely powerful, and he himself had experienced it. At that time, the 2 sides did not even face off, and he was defeated. And the battle situation in the past month has also proved that it is difficult to win this battle with only the little force in his hands, plus the peasants in the South Netherlands who can't even stand in a company. He sighed, sat down behind the desk, and wrote a letter for help to his brother-in-law, King George III of the United Kingdom. Originally, he sent troops to intervene in the situation in the South Netherlands at the request of George III, but now this has become his own war. After putting the letter into the envelope, he felt that it was not safe enough, so he picked up the pen again and wrote a letter to British Prime Minister Pitt the Younger. The core content of the 2 letters was basically the same, both asking Britain to send troops to reinforce Brussels. While Carol II was anxious about the war situation, Joseph was reviewing the results of the recruitment examination of the Southern Netherlands Military Supplies Preparation Committee that had just been submitted. Yes, Joseph II agreed to France's request for logistical supplies in the southern part of the southern Netherlands almost without hesitation, and ordered Austrian officials in the southern Netherlands to fully cooperate. At the same time, he also wrote back to highly affirm the decisive role played by the French army in quelling the rebellion in the southern Netherlands and combating the invading forces such as Prussia and Hanover. At the end of the letter, the Holy Roman Emperor mentioned that Luxembourg would be used as a thank you for France's troops. After that, Joseph ordered the establishment of this Military Supplies Preparation Committee, which actually took over the taxation, finance and commercial trade of the Wallonia region. After monopolizing the financial power, the administrative management of the Wallonia region was basically decided by the preparatory committee. If any local official did not obey, you can forget about your salary next month. The higher level officials of the committee were all transferred from France, while the middle and lower level officials were all locals in Wallonia. Joseph borrowed the experience of the previous civil servant recruitment examination in Tunisia, and also held a recruitment examination in Wallonia. Naturally, he claimed to the outside world that it was to select capable people to raise urgently needed materials for the front line as soon as possible, but in fact it was to win over the elite class in Wallonia. As he expected, the nobles and capitalists in Wallonia flocked to this assessment, and the examination was completed in less than 3 weeks with extremely high efficiency. Joseph looked at the names of the 103 selected candidates and the positions recommended for them by the chairman of the committee, former assistant to the municipal commissioner of L'État, France, and shook his head slightly. Seeing this, Farley's heart tightened, and he hurriedly stepped forward and said, "Your Highness, are there any inappropriate things about these positions?" Joseph raised the documents in his hand. "Can 103 people ensure the supply of materials on the front line? Once the logistics supply is problematic, we may lose the war at any time." Farley was stunned. "What do you mean?" "At least 300 positions responsible for raising materials are needed to be safe." Although President Farley was confused, he naturally had no objection, since the Crown Prince was willing to pay the salary. "Ah, yes, Your Highness, I will start to adjust it immediately." Joseph naturally did not have too much salary to pay, but the people recruited in this exam were basically the team he would manage the bureaucratic system of Wallonia in the future, and 300 people were far from enough. He looked at Viscount Flot on the side, the elite who had personally delivered intelligence and oaths to the Guards Corps before. "There are 30 more positions. Please discuss with several other coordinators, and recommend some talented people to me." Viscount Flot is currently the coordinator of the committee in Mons, which is basically equivalent to the deputy mayor. As a representative of the noble power in Wallonia, the people he nominated must be influential in Wallonia. This is equivalent to the formation of a community of interests between France and the local people of Wallonia. In the future, even if Austria does not want to let go of Wallonia, these people will be the first to oppose it. "Thank you for your trust." Viscount Flot hurriedly touched his chest and saluted, saying excitedly, "I will do my best to select the best talents for you, then I'll trouble you." Joseph smiled and nodded, and then continued, "Oh, regarding the establishment of the Wallonia Coal Industry Joint Company, please cooperate with President Fully." "Yes, Your Highness." The so-called Wallonia Coal Industry Association is a company funded by the French Reserve Bank to acquire or control coal mines in Wallonia. Affected by the war, the price of coal mines has also experienced a cliff-like drop in recent months, which is the best time to invest. However, unlike the small Luxembourg, the French Reserve Bank is unable to buy all the coal mines, so Joseph brought in investors from France and Wallonia to invest in this company together. Of course, the decision-making power must be in the hands of the French Reserve Bank. As the largest investor, with the support of the Military Supplies Preparatory Committee, the French Reserve Bank was elected as the only veto director without much effort. It won't be long before Wallonia's huge coal reserves, which are enough to match those of the Ruhr area in Germany, can become a strong support for the French Industrial Revolution. And when the Coal Industry Association gets orders from France continuously, the profitable Wallonia investors, sellers, and workers will also have a stronger dependence on France. The British Foreign Secretary, the Marquis of Wellesley, did not go directly to Paris as the Prime Minister requested to negotiate with France on India's interests, but took a ship to go to Brussels via the port of Amsterdam. Braving the war, he knew very well that the bargaining chips in his hand were far from enough to trade India with the French. So he hoped to find some bargaining chips on the front line of the southern Netherlands. However, as soon as he got off the ship, he received news that Charles II had asked Britain for help. Chapter 368 Rebellion against Chiangang. In front of the Parliament building of the southern Netherlands when Karel II met the Marquis of Wellesley, he thought that the latter had brought him news that London was determined to reinforce Brussels, and he was so excited that he almost burst into tears. However, the Foreign Secretary poured cold water on him. "Dear Marshal, my personal position is very much in favor of sending troops to reinforce you immediately. But, to tell you the truth, the East India Company has encountered some troubles in the Far East. At the moment, the Empire the main focus will be there, perhaps early next year, before you can wait for reinforcement from the Congress. Of course, Parliament will definitely give you full support in terms of military spending and weapons." This time, it was not only Karel II, but also the Speaker of the Southern Netherlands, Van der Noort, who was on the side. He was also anxious. "My Lord Marquis, you may have learned about the situation in Brussels. If we cannot defeat the French as soon as possible, we will have to wait until Austria deploys its troops. Brussels will be difficult to hold, and the revolution will fail." Marquis Wellesley glanced at him and said in a cold voice, "Personally, I don't agree with your revolution, but now we have a common enemy to deal with. Oh, are we just going to stand in the square and discuss things? No, no, we have prepared a sumptuous banquet for you. Van Dernert hurriedly motioned to the Parliament building. Please come in quickly. In the banquet hall, Marquis Wellesley glanced at the dejected officers on both sides of the long and narrow dining table, turned to Carol II and said, Marshal, you are saying that the French army only has 14,000 people, so you need ask Parliament for help. Before Carol II could say anything, General Bronkhorst, the Dutch commander on the side, rushed to say, Your Majesty, the French are equipped with an astonishingly powerful musket, and their cannons are elusive, causing damage to our army. A huge threat. The Foreign Secretary sneered and shook his head. In his opinion, this was just an excuse for the Dutch to make excuses for their incompetence. He tapped the table with his spoon irritably. He originally came to Brussels to see the military advantages here, so that he could use them as bargaining chips. Unexpectedly, the chips were not found, but there was a group of people waiting for him to persuade the Parliament to wipe their ass. Van der Noort suddenly clenched his fists with righteous indignation and said, we should mobilize the French people to carry out a revolution together and overthrow that tyrant. General Ortelius, the new commander of the National Guard next to him, immediately agreed. Yes, we have many revolutionaries in Lille, Artois and other places, and we can let them lead the French people's revolution. Fight for their freedom and right. The vent-like words between the two caught the attention of the Marquis of Wellesley. He looked at Van der Noort and whispered, are you saying that there are people from the Southern Netherlands Revolutionary Party in France? That's right. The latter nodded. In order to escape the persecution of the Austrians, our revolutionaries often hid in northern France. Over the years, we have many footholds there, and we also have good relations with the local liberals. Marquis Wellesley's eyes suddenly lit up. Within half a month, how many people can you mobilize to incite, call for revolution in France? And how many people can you mobilize to respond? Van der Noort immediately said, we now have more than 40 people across France. If necessary, we can immediately mobilize 200 revolutionaries to go to France. Historically, the revolution of the Southern Netherlands was supported by the French Grand Order, and the two sides were very closely connected. The Southern Netherlands often solicited sponsorship from French nobles who were sympathetic to the revolution, so many people stayed in France. Van der Noort thought for a while, and then said hesitantly, but the revolutionary momentum in France in the past 2 years is not very good. Many people who used to hold revolutionary attitudes have turned into advocates of the tyrant. Especially in France, ordinary farmers and citizens became content with the status quo after the tyrant gave them some benefits. So, this is never a good time to help France start a revolution. The Marquis of Wellesley glared at him impatiently and said displeasedly, in your poor vocabulary, there is no other way to call the king of a country except tyrant, even if we don't like Louis XVI. But you also need to maintain basic courtesy towards him. Van der Noort then remembered that all he relied on were countries under the rule of monarchs, and could only nod awkwardly. Yes, I'm sorry. The Marquis of Wellesley narrowed his eyes, tapped the plate with a spoon, and said in a deep voice, actually, there is a powder keg in France right now. If your people can make good use of this opportunity, they may not be able to set off a fire in France. A storm. The Governor of Hanover and the Dutch commander beside him immediately looked over in surprise. When they heard this, there was a hint of pride in Marquis Wellesley's tone. You should have heard that the French government wants to abolish the traditional taxes handed over by farmers to lords, but it has not announced a specific plan on how to let farmers buy land. Carol II subconsciously said, so, this is your chance to plunge France into turmoil. Several other people looked at each other in surprise, obviously not understanding what the British Foreign Secretary meant. Marquis Wellesley caught a glimpse of their expressions and sighed helplessly. Think about why the French didn't announce their land purchase plan. Because it is too difficult for both parties involved in this matter, the nobles and the peasants, to reach an agreement. The nobles want the peasants to pay a huge amount of money to maintain a luxurious life for themselves and their descendants, while the peasants hope to get the land without paying a penny. They are definitely willing to hang the other party on the gallows for this. To be honest, Wellesley is definitely a man of great strategy, and saw the crux of the problem at a glance. Historically, the Feuillants, the first to form a government after the French Revolution, were constitutional monarchists. And it was because they formulated a land redemption policy that favored the nobles, requiring peasants to redeem feudal rents and taxes, as well as a price of up to 30 years of land income, that aroused the dissatisfaction of the peasant class and eventually drove the Feuillants out of power. The Girondists later abolished all feudal rents and taxes, but recognized the rents and taxes on land that was not granted by the king. The peasants were still dissatisfied with this, because a large amount of land had been bought at a low price by nobles or capitalists before, but they had to pay a higher redemption price for it at this time point. So the Jacobins raised their arms and called for action, and the famine happened to happen at the time, so the Girondists stepped down. Sadly, it was not until the Jacobins forced the burning of all the nobles' land deeds and sold the land to the peasants at a low price that the land problem in France was basically solved. However, the Jacobins were able to solve this problem based on the fact that most of the nobles had been beheaded at that time. It was equivalent to using the family wealth of the nobles to satisfy the interests of the peasants in France. The nobles are still very strong. Chapter 369 Garbage time on the battlefield. Carol II still looked puzzled, but there is no conflict between the French peasants and nobles at the moment, Marquis. Wellesley waved the spoon in his hand at him, as if it was his sword. Then let's do something to break the peace between them. What do you mean? We will promulgate a land redemption policy on behalf of the French government. I will mobilize the channels in Paris to publicize to the nobles that the French government will distribute land to farmers at a very low price, Marquis. Wellesley pointed to Van der Not and said, your people will tell the French peasants that the king has decided to let them pay for the cost of supporting the nobles for hundreds of years. When both sides are extremely dissatisfied, you will unite with the French liberals and lead the peasants to revolt. France will surely fall into chaos. Van der Not nodded excitedly, and then hesitated and said, my lord Marquis, but the French government will definitely come out to refute the rumors. Wellesley smiled. In this case, unless they officially announce the land redemption plan, no one will believe it, no matter how they refute the rumors, and now any redemption plan is unlikely to satisfy both the peasants and the nobles. We will support whichever side's interests are affected by the plan. All France can get is a chaos sweeping the country. The city of Namur, south of Brussels. André Davout, commander of the Moulins Corps, saw the crown prince coming to greet him from afar, jumped off his horse, stepped forward quickly, took off his hat and bowed. You look really good, your highness. Luxembourg is now talking about the battle where you defeated the Hanoverians. You have almost become a legend. Victory belongs to everyone in the Guards Corps. Joseph smiled and nodded in return, and patted his arm again. I'm completely relieved that the Moulins Corps has arrived in Brussels. Let's go into the city first. You can only rest for 3 days, and then we will go to the town of Lully for garrison. The Moulins Corps is at your service at any time, André said loudly. Immediately. Joseph received a report from the Palace of Versailles a few days ago, saying that the British Foreign Secretary will visit Paris in the middle of next month to discuss some important issues between the two countries. Joseph estimated that the war in India must have hurt the British, and they came to seek peace. This matter is of great importance, and it is definitely not possible to leave it to my mother to deal with, so he decided to return to the country. In addition, he can also communicate with my mother about France's major strategies to prevent the danger of the last time the Russian ambassador tried to conclude a secret agreement. The confrontation on the Brussels front has entered garbage time. At present, France is unwilling to launch an attack, and Charles II cannot attack. Both sides casually fire a few shots at each other every day, and then withdraw their troops, so even if he leaves the southern Netherlands, there should be no problem here. However, for the sake of safety, he still transferred 2 regiments of the Moulin Corps stationed in Luxembourg. Although the combat effectiveness of the Moulin Corps is not as good as the Guards Corps, it is more than enough to deal with the Hanover army. How is the battle situation in Liege? Joseph looked at André, who was riding a horse with him. It's rather dull, I guess. André spread his hands. Lefebvre complained every day about why he couldn't attack the Prussians. The Prussians built a long and narrow breastwork along the border between Liege and Long, and set up many cannons, but they haven't attacked for a long time. After learning that the Hanoverian army had been defeated, and the front line had stabilized in the Brussels area, Blücher had lost the will to continue fighting. Even if he could defeat Leo's Austrian army, he would be in a standoff with the French army in Brussels. What he wanted was to go to Silesia to make achievements, not to waste time in the southern Netherlands. However, some idiots in Prussia, probably Mollendorf and others, kept advising His Majesty the King that they could never accept the humiliating situation of being driven out of the southern Netherlands by Austria. Finally, he received an order from the King, asking him to repel the Austrian army in Luxembourg and reinforce Brussels as soon as possible. Blücher's troops had been beaten up by the Guards Corps before, and their morale was low. After trying to attack Leo twice and being repelled, they lost the will to continue the attack. Leo knew his own weight and was even more reluctant to attack. Lefebvre received Joseph's order not to annihilate the Prussian army on a large scale. So the battle in Liege also started garbage time. After Joseph got the details of the Liege-Luxembourg line from André, he was completely relieved. The next morning, he took a car back to Paris. The rail transit from Luxembourg to Verdun has begun to be built. As for Verdun, the wooden track has been built in the previous preparations. After leaving Verdun, it takes half a day to take a carriage and then continue to the wooden track connecting Reims to Paris. The whole journey took only a little more than 5 days, and nearly 2 days of it were delayed in the southern Netherlands. Moreover, the driving on the wooden track was extremely stable. When he arrived in the northern suburbs of Paris, Joseph did not feel the fatigue he had when he went out before, and he could go to the Palace of Versailles to do business immediately. Since the Palace of Versailles was not notified in advance, there was no ceremonial guard to greet him. Joseph's motorcade passed through the streets of Paris quickly, and from time to time he could hear passers-by talking about the 2 great victories of the French army not long ago. 4 or 5 children suddenly rushed out from the corner of the street, holding wooden sticks and making bang bang sounds, charging at another group of children. Emin, who was sitting opposite the carriage, looked out the window and said to Joseph, "Your Highness, it is said that the most popular game among children in Paris recently is this Prince versus Prussians. I saw it in a letter from my father. My younger brother is 13 years old and still enjoys playing this." He suddenly remembered that His Royal Highness the Crown Prince was leading police reform when he was 13 years old, and he couldn't help but sigh in his heart, maybe he will become an excellent soldier when he grows up. Joseph smiled and truly defeat the Prussian army on the battlefield. Emin hurriedly said, "Thank you for your encouragement, Your Highness. I will definitely urge him to work hard." The car quickly drove into the Palace of Versailles. A court lady saw Joseph from the car window and hurriedly picked up her skirt and ran to the Petit Trianon Palace, shouting to the Queen's maid, "His Royal Highness the Crown Prince is back." Joseph did not wait for the nobles to gather around and ordered the coachman to go directly to his mother's bedroom. After Queen Mary continued to ask about his well-being for more than half an hour and asked the servants to bring the Dutch-style desserts recently developed by the royal chef, Joseph finally found a gap to talk about business. Chapter 370. For Mother, there is only one big thing in the world. Queen Mary looked at her son in surprise. The piece of Belgian pastry wrapped with sugar and covered with cocoa powder she held in her hand was never put into her mouth. "You mean?" Archbishop Talleyrand expressed support to Russia for their occupation of Sweden. Did this happen with your permission?" "Ah, it's my foreign policy advice to him." Joseph didn't want his mother to think that the foreign minister ignored her, so he had to choose a tactful way of saying it, and he happened to agree with it. "But why are you indulging the Russians? To make them forget about Poland for a while. You know, once the Russian army is idle, Poland will suffer." Queen Mary blinked. "In this case, we should directly negotiate with Russia instead of sacrificing Sweden." Joseph secretly pinched the armrest of the chair and patiently explained, "Sweden can resist the Russian invasion, but I don't think Sweden is much stronger than Poland. Sweden will receive aid from Britain and Prussia." "How can you be sure?" "That's it." An hour and a half later, Queen Mary no longer cared about dessert. She looked at the crown prince with only shock in her eyes. So, your strategy is to stabilize the situation around Tunisia first, and then let Lafayette the Marquis went to India, to cause trouble for the British? I just gave some advice to the Minister of War. The Marquis of Lafayette went to the Far East, after receiving an order from Duke Broy. Joseph had to try his best to make up for the cabinet ministers. According to the Intelligence Bureau's investigation, Algiers and Tripoli are both supported by the British. If India needs the British to invest huge power, then our pressure in North Africa will be reduced. You see, immediately after Mysore declared war on the British East India Company, the British Foreign Secretary came to Paris. If I guess correctly, he came to ask us not to interfere with the situation in India. Of course, we can't agree so easily, and we have recently defeated the Hanoverian army. We must consider it, after he has paid enough benefits. Queen Mary didn't pay much attention to her son's words behind her. She was filled with excitement and pride at this time. My son has grown up, and is so outstanding. He talks about these international events with great clarity. Even Archbishop Brian could not speak as clearly as he did before. At the same time, she felt a little melancholy. If he continues at this pace, his son will soon no longer need his own protection. He will spread his wings and fly away from the nest he built for him like a bird with full wings. She was suddenly startled and then shook her head vigorously. What are you thinking about? My son will be 16 soon. He is already an adult. He is the son of God. She couldn't always hold him in her arms like she did when he was a child. It's time for him to spread his wings and soar over the vast sky of France. And it's clear that he can do it very well. Thinking of this, there was only one thing left in Queen Mary's mind. Joseph, you will be 16 years old in a few months. I know that you have great ideals and want to devote all your energy to a strong country, but you also have to think about your marriage. You don't have to get married yet, but this doesn't affect your choice of a fiancé. For the sake of God, just let me and your father feel at ease. She lowered her voice again. To be honest, you don't like men, do you? Oh, it was your father who mentioned this to me. Joseph suddenly felt dizzy. How could you suddenly switch to this topic when talking about national affairs? Of course not. He hurriedly shook his head and said, don't worry, I will definitely choose a girl I like to get married. Queen Mary immediately seized the opportunity and said, so, look at Clementine. Mother, my cousin is very good, but she is definitely not my ideal wife. Then, the Princess of Sicily, isn't it? What about the Princess of Savoy? Not even. The Spanish princess. Joseph didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Although his mother listed almost all the princesses from the surrounding countries, thanks to the bad customs among European royal families basically only intermarrying among several major royal families and never introducing new DNA as a result, all the girls she mentioned are close relatives to herself. The farthest ones are also collateral relatives within 3 generations. Needless to say, the closest ones are like Clementine. How can this thing get married? Seeing that Queen Mary had begun to extend her candidacy to England with a solemn expression, Joseph could no longer hold back. Well, dear mother, my request is actually very simple. He gritted his teeth and said, that is, I hope to marry a girl who is not related to me by blood. Why is this? Joseph's head suddenly got big. If he said that marrying close relatives can easily lead to fools, he seemed to be scolding his parents. After all, my grandparents and maternal grandparents were all consanguineous marriages. Moreover, as a person who has been baptized with the concepts of the 21st century, he cannot ethically accept a close relative wife. This, he said thoughtfully, is about genetics. That, mental. Oh, no, he hasn't. Queen Mary looked at her son with a constipated expression, suddenly showed a kind smile, took his hand and said, okay, I understand. But as the French crown prince, you really can't marry a commoner. In her opinion, her son must have made up this reason in order to marry a commoner girl. Joseph said subconsciously, I didn't say I wanted to marry a commoner. Oh, really, marry a princess? I really want to marry a princess. Joseph was exhausted and said with certainty, as long as she is not a close relative. At this moment, Brian came with an important document. to ask Her Majesty the Queen to sign, which interrupted the conversation between the two. Joseph took the opportunity to escape from the forced marriage scene. After handling government affairs, Queen Mary walked to the balcony, looking at the various vegetables and flowers in the yard, but she was recalling what her son had just said. There can't be a blood relationship. She frowned slightly. But you said you want to marry a princess. Is there such a princess in the European royal family? In fact, even the British royal family has a blood relationship with the French royal family, although it is already relatively thin. And we can't really let the crown prince marry an English woman. What is my son thinking? Queen Mary pondered, and suddenly a little girl's gentle big eyes popped up in her mind. She was immediately enlightened. The little girl had no blood relationship with the French royal family. So Joseph likes that little girl. Well, although she is a little young, she is really very cute, especially her eyes. By the way, she is in Paris now. No wonder Joseph suddenly rushed back from the southern Netherlands. She remembered that Joseph had said that he wanted to marry a princess of a powerful country. Although Russia is poor and backward, it has a vast area and a large population. It is definitely a powerful country. She suddenly felt a little guilty. It turned out that her son had mentioned the person he liked to her a long time ago, but she never understood it. He is really a shy child. He likes other girls, but doesn't say it directly, and his parents keep guessing. Although Queen Mary was a little disappointed about Clementine's failure, she soon became happy again. At least she was sure that her son didn't like men. Chapter 371 New Artifact. Joseph had no idea that Queen Mary had arranged a new marriage for him, and it was a very cute little girl. At the dinner, he was still cautiously preparing to continue to deal with his mother's urging to get married, but the queen just gave him a look of I understand from time to time, and did not mention it again, but talked about some Russian customs at the subsequent dance. Joseph became the focus of all the nobles. A prince who was less than 16 years old led his troops to defeat the Prussian and Hanoverian armies on the battlefield, which made the nobles constantly compare him with the Sun King Louis XIV. Some people even said that His Royal Highness the Crown Prince will definitely surpass the Sun King. When Louis XVI said that he wanted to build a statue for the Crown Prince, some ministers did not agree. After all, the king himself did not have a formal statue in public. After the news that the Gardes Corps defeated Charles II was sent back to Paris, no one raised any objections. Artists from all walks of life gathered at the Palace of Versailles upon hearing the news, vying to sculpt the statue of the Crown Prince. The ball started with the passionate music triumph, and all the way was about war and victory. The nobles also changed their usual gentle style and danced in a military style. When the ball was halfway through, a famous poet came to the center of the Hall of Mirrors and recited a hymn to Joseph loudly, which directly pushed the atmosphere to a climax. Joseph looked at the nobles who were extremely excited at the ball and praised him generously, and couldn't help but sigh in his heart. Sure enough, victory in foreign wars is the best stimulant for a country. The dissatisfaction and opposition caused by the abolition of noble privileges have now basically subsided. At least on the surface, the nobles have become extremely supportive of the royal family. I hope this can reduce the resistance to the land redemption policy on the noble side. The ball lasted until late at night, and Joseph was able to return to the palace. Various social activities made him feel more tired than fighting 3 days on the front line. The next morning. Joseph had a simple breakfast and dragged his tired body to the royal armory next to the plane tree forest on the southeast side of the Palace of Versailles. A British foreign secretary would not arrive in Paris for about a week. He had to take advantage of this gap to hurry up and make the bulletproof inserts that he had been planning for a long time. As soon as he walked out of the palace gate, Joseph saw that the spacious corridor was full of noble ladies dressed up in fancy clothes. In an instant, all kinds of bold, graceful, and resentful seductive eyes came from all directions, making his scalp numb. Eamon leaned close to his ear and whispered, "Your Highness, most of them have been waiting here at 3 or 4 in the morning. Some even didn't leave after the ball ended." Perna, who had just finished a routine examination for Joseph, followed him out. the eyes of the ladies around her suddenly became cold and murderous, which frightened her so much that she lowered her head and fled back to the imperial doctor's office on the second floor. Joseph ignored the beautiful scenery along the way and walked quickly to the outside of the Palace of Versailles. When he arrived at the square, he touched his chin with stubble and gritted his teeth in his heart. Let you jump. When my puberty is over, I will definitely pick a few to slaughter. Martinal, the head of the Royal Ordnance Factory, obviously expected that His Royal Highness the Crown Prince would come, and he waited at the door with a group of managers early in the morning. Joseph nodded to the bowing group, and then went straight to the point. Mr. Martinal, are all the things I asked you to prepare ready? The latter hurriedly pointed to a shed on the west side. Yes, Your Highness. Everything is ready, just put it there. When Joseph was in the southern Netherlands, he wrote a letter to list the materials needed to make bulletproof inserts, attach simple process requirements, and send it to the Royal Ordnance Factory. After entering the shed, Martinia had boxes of iron sheets, porcelain sheets, silk and other things placed in front of the Crown Prince, and asked for credit. Your Highness, look, I asked the craftsman to make iron sheets of different hardness and thickness for you to choose. The porcelain sheets were customized from the two top workshops in Sevres, and Quimper also had a trial copy made. Sevres is a porcelain making sanctuary in the western suburbs of Paris. Most of the nobles who can't afford Oriental porcelain and disdain British goods will choose the products here. Quimper is the center of painted pottery in Brittany, and its main sales target is ordinary people. But the workshops here also have many unique firing techniques. Joseph nodded with satisfaction. After all, the Royal Ordnance Factory was personally in charge of by his father, and he was quite reliable in doing things. He asked the most concerned question again. What about the adhesive? Does Mr. Lavoisier have any suggestions? Yes, Your Highness. Martinia pointed to a large glass bottle on the table. Mr. Lavoisier recommended this special casein glue. Casein glue. Joseph looked at the beige viscous liquid in the bottle curiously. It is an adhesive made from milk. Martinia said hurriedly. First, ferment the milk to remove the grease, and then add alkali, water, glass, slaked lime and other substances to promote coagulation. Filter. Joseph had never heard of adhesive made from milk, but for now he could only trust Lavoisier. He immediately took out iron sheets, porcelain sheets and other items of different specifications from the wooden box, and called the craftsman to prepare for trial production. He had seen a documentary introducing bulletproof inserts before, and immediately instructed the craftsman, please stick the iron sheets, porcelain sheets, silk, and iron sheets together in order. Note that they must be compacted as much as possible. Put the silk on the outer layer, followed by the iron sheet and the porcelain sheet, and finally the silk. Use the iron sheet on the outermost layer, followed by the silk. He was unsure of the effectiveness of these 18th century alternative materials, so he asked the craftsman to try out 5 combinations according to different combinations. At the same time, each combination required the use of plates of different thicknesses and different amounts of adhesive, and a total of more than 40 test samples were produced. It was around 3 p.m. that a craftsman told Joseph that the casein glue processed by heating and drying it was dry. Joseph took the plug, which was about the same size as the tablet computer of later generations, and tried to pull the iron and porcelain pieces to the sides. It didn't move at all. Very strong. He was relieved immediately. It seemed that this adhesive made from milk was basically usable. He didn't know much about adhesives. In fact, casein glue has the advantages of high viscosity, fast curing speed, and strong bonding force, and it is still widely used in the 21st century. And Lavoisier specially adjusted the manufacturing process according to his requirements to maximize the bonding strength. It is definitely impossible to break it apart by hand. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story, and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 372. Father and Son Unite. Prepare a few guns. Let's go to the shooting range. Joseph signaled to Martiniere, and was about to carry the bulletproof insert he had just completed to conduct a field test, when he heard Emmanuel say beside him, "Your Highness, His Majesty the King is here." Joseph turned around and saw Louis XVI walking into the shed with a smug smile. "Well, my dear Joseph, you are here. I guess you must have invented something interesting, then." He muttered a little resentfully, "Why don't you ask me to come along? We are the best partners." "Oh, forget it. Let me see what good things my genius son has come up with first." However, when he took the bulletproof insert handed over by Joseph, he frowned slightly. "This is a piece of iron plate. This is not a simple iron plate." Joseph took his father to the shooting range. "It can withstand bullets." Louis XVI weighed the bulletproof insert in his hand in disbelief. "This thing is only 3 pounds at most." "Oh, now it has been changed to standard measurement. It should be 1.5 kilograms. It can actually block bullets." As a science and engineering geek, he has some knowledge of armor and the like. Even a breastplate weighing more than 10 kilograms will often be penetrated if the bullet's angle of incidence is vertical point, and the crown prince actually wanted to use such a thin piece of thing to block bullets. "You will know when you take a look." Joseph gave his father a mysterious smile and then ordered the guards to fix the bulletproof insert on the wooden target, and then took a percussion gun from Martiniere. It was recently produced by the Royal Ordnance Factory and had just completed the calibration point. Joseph came to 60 steps away from the target, pulled the bolt, installed a percussion cap, and squinted at the bulletproof insert and the distance pointer. Loud bang. Off target point. Joseph reloaded awkwardly and raised his gun to shoot again. Bang. Still off target point. It's not that his shooting skills are poor. In the era of smoothbore guns, whether you can hit the target at 60 steps depends largely on luck. Finally, after the percussion gun sounded for the third time, the bulletproof insert in the distance trembled obviously. 2 soldiers at the shooting range immediately ran to carry the target over. Louis XVI curiously went forward to check and saw that the iron plate was dented a lot, but it was obviously not pierced. He immediately looked at Joseph in shock. "How is this possible? It's only such a thin piece." Joseph was not surprised at all. He had just set the shooting distance to 60 steps, leaving a large margin. According to his idea, the insert should be able to block the shooting of the British Brown Bess 1777 flintlock rifle at 30 steps. He took the bulletproof insert off the target with a smile and explained to his father, "Dear father, in fact, this thing is not just an iron sheet." He pointed to the insert that was somewhat layered by the huge impact force. "Look, there is a porcelain sheet behind the iron sheet." Porcelain sheet? What can such a brittle thing do? Disperse the impact of the bullet. Joseph said, "You can see from the edge that the porcelain sheet has been broken because the cracks extend horizontally. The vertical impact can be dispersed in the horizontal direction, and behind this is a layer of silk. Silk is extremely tough and can wrap the first 2 layers so that they will not be torn apart by instantaneous deformation. As for the last layer of iron sheet, it is used to improve reliability. You see, there are only slight marks on it." Louis XVI's eyes widened, and he looked at the bulletproof insert in his hand over and over again, nodding his head. The simplest structure often has unexpectedly excellent performance. "Joseph, how did you come up with this idea? It's so amazing." Joseph thought that he saw it from the documentary, but he still followed the old routine and drew a cross on his chest. "I think this must be a revelation from God." Louis XVI immediately drew a cross very devoutly after hearing this. Thank God Almighty. In the past 2 years, as his son continued to receive revelations from God, he became 100 times more pious than before. Joseph said something that shocked him even more. "This bulletproof insert should still have some power. Let's shorten the distance to 50 steps and try again." The new insert was fixed. Joseph stuffed the gun to his father as thick smoke gushed out of the muzzle. Louis XVI accurately hit the bulletproof insert with 1 shot, and then he raised his eyebrows at his son, who had hit the target 3 times before. Showing off. The soldier quickly brought the target. Joseph hurried forward to check the insert. The crater was deeper than before, but it was still not penetrated. He turned the insert over and saw that there was only an almost invisible dent on the back of the last layer of iron sheet. Obviously, the wearer would not be in any danger of life point this time. Before he could speak, Louis XVI spoke first. Maybe it can be closer. As the test continued, the bulletproof insert was finally penetrated when the shooting distance was shortened to 28 steps. Then Louis XVI and his son continued to test bulletproof inserts made of several other models. When it got dark, they slept together in the arsenal and talked about various guns and mechanical topics until after 2 in the morning. In the next few days, the father and son stayed in the arsenal, conducting a series of tests and improvements on bulletproof inserts of all combinations and different materials, and finally determined several types for mass production. Joseph looked at the production process documents in his hand and told Martiniere, first produce 6,000 pieces of general purpose, 2,000 pieces of heavy duty, 500 pieces of high quality. After testing for a few days, he found that double layer iron plates were not needed to deal with soft lead bullets in the 18th century. So under the advice of his father, he used a structure of iron sheets, cotton, ceramics, and silk to control the weight of the bulletproof insert to 1.05 kilograms, which could stably resist flintlock shooting at 40 steps. This general purpose bulletproof insert has the lowest price, costing only 5 livres and 16 sous. If necessary, even silk can be saved, and the price drops sharply to less than 4 livres, but the bulletproof distance also drops to 55 steps. The heavy-duty insert is the first structure tested before, with double-layer iron sheets in front and back, weighing 1.4 kilograms, and can be penetrated by flintlock at a distance of 28 steps. Specially for cavalry. Cost 6 livres and 10 sous. The high quality type is a single layer iron sheet with a double layer of silk. Its weight is equivalent to that of the general type, and its stable bulletproof distance is 33 steps. However, the price is as high as 8 livres and 5 sous, and it can generally only be equipped for officers. In fact, Joseph originally planned to directly produce more than 100,000 pieces and distribute them to all members of the Guards Corps. However, the bottleneck of adhesives limited his ambitions. Although casein glue has excellent performance, it can only be produced in small doses at present, and the price is not cheap. As for other natural adhesives, they are basically useless. Joseph recalled the various phenol adhesives in later generations, and his desire to promote gas street lamps as soon as possible and light up the organic chemical industry became stronger. Chapter 373. I bring furniture evolution to Europe. After Joseph finished explaining the trial production of bulletproof inserts, he felt exhausted all over these days. He worked non-stop in the arsenal, which made him feel like he was back to the time when he was working on a project with his mentor in his previous life. Fortunately, he had his father to help him, so he didn't get tired to death. He watched Louis XVI go to the Petit Trianon Palace. His Majesty the King had indulged in craftsmanship these days, and missed his wife a little. He did not delay, and immediately drove to the Royal Gunpowder Bureau in Paris, to discuss the production of casein glue with Lavoisier, if the problem of adhesive quantity production is not solved. The huge strategic value of bulletproof inserts cannot be reflected. When Joseph's carriage stopped in front of the office building of the Royal Gunpowder Bureau, the entire Gunpowder Bureau immediately became agitated. The management and craftsmen here have more or less some relationship with the military, and are very concerned about the victory on the front line. People dropped their work, and came to see the legendary hero who created the great victory of the southern Netherlands, His Royal Highness the Crown Prince. In the end, Joseph, who was strongly watched, had to pull Lavoisier away from the Gunpowder Bureau, and go to his office in the Tuileries Palace, to discuss things at the Gunpowder Bureau. People watched the prince's carriage go away. After a long time, they finally went back to work reluctantly under the roar of the supervisors in Joseph's carriage. After listening to the prince's request, Lavoisier frowned slightly and said, "Your Highness, it is not difficult to produce casein glue, but the demand for your bulletproof inserts may be difficult to support large-scale production." Joseph was stunned when he heard this, and he was also busy. Yes, in the pre-industrial era, as long as you are willing to invest, and there are no technical obstacles, almost anything can be mass-produced. But the problem is who to sell the products to. If you can't sell them, you can only keep losing money. Although he is willing to lose money in terms of manufacturing important military equipment, it is not a good thing. To keep going like this, he looked at the father of chemistry and asked, "Mr. Lavoisier, as far as you know, who needs to use this adhesive?" "Oh, in the past, only carpenters used a small amount, and leather workers occasionally used a little to glue the soles of shoes. They usually went to the pharmacy to order a small bottle at the beginning of each year." "Carpenters, yes, your highness," Lavoisier said. "Casein glue was first invented to meet the needs of carpenters. But you know, this invention didn't make him any money." Joseph thought thoughtfully. "Can you tell me in detail under what circumstances carpenters will use this thing?" "Any occasion where nails cannot be used, your highness. Casein glue is very strong in bonding wood. After drying, the bonded part is even harder than the wood itself." As Lavoisier introduced the properties of casein glue in detail, Joseph's eyes gradually lit up. If the drying strength of casein glue is so high and its affinity with wood is excellent, can't it be used to make artificial boards? He knew that ordinary people in later generations rarely used pure solid wood furniture, and 90% of the furniture in the market were made of synthetic boards such as density boards and particle boards. These artificial boards are made of waste materials such as wood residues and sawdust, mixed with adhesives and pressed. Don't underestimate this kind of waste utilization thing. Artificial synthetic boards triggered the furniture evolution in the late 19th century. First of all, the price of synthetic boards is much lower than that of solid wood. This is mainly because the solid wood that can be used to make furniture is basically limited to the main trunk of a straight tree, and those branches or crooked trees cannot be used. Synthetic boards can use a whole tree to make furniture, because no matter whether it is crooked or broken, it can all be crushed and glued into standard square boards. Although there are more adhesives and processing costs, the overall price is still very low. Similar to the shipbuilding industry in the 18th century, which is a large consumer of wood, the useless wood thrown away every year is enough to replace new furniture for all French people. If an artificial board manufacturing plant can be built near the Brittany shipyard, an industrial chain of wood shipbuilding synthetic board furniture can be formed, and even the cost of shipbuilding can be reduced a lot. In addition, more importantly, the biggest advantage of synthetic board over solid wood is not cost. This may be different from people's usual impression, but the reason why synthetic board can trigger a furniture evolution is mainly because it has several incomparable advantages. The first is easy processing. Synthetic board is basically square and flat on both sides when it leaves the factory. Carpenters can quickly assemble furniture with just a saw. Carpenters who make furniture with solid wood are still grunting and processing wooden boards in this way. The output of furniture will increase several times or even dozens of times, and the styles will increase accordingly. People who buy furniture will have more choices and lower prices, which will naturally set off a sales boom. You must know that the most profitable industrial products are never the most sophisticated, but the ones that can meet the basic needs of the largest population. Just like Mercedes-Benz and BMW in later generations, they can't beat Toyota and Volkswagen for ordinary consumers in the end. Second, the nail holding performance of synthetic boards is much stronger than that of solid wood boards. Since the wood of solid wood boards is dense, there will be a force that pushes the nails outward, while synthetic boards that are glued together with wood residues do not have this problem. This leads to the durability of furniture made of synthetic boards being stronger than that of solid wood boards. Of course, this can be solved by using the mortise and tenon structure of the East, but currently European furniture is still mainly nailed. If you want hundreds of thousands of carpenters to change their usual skills, it would be impossible unless God really appeared. Finally, the moth proofing of synthetic boards is dozens of blocks better than that of solid wood boards. Well, adhesives are more disgusting than dog shit to moths, not to mention that they are poisonous. Durable, moth-proof, and cheap furniture can easily overturn solid wood furniture and occupy the market. Thinking of this, Joseph suppressed his excitement and asked Lavoisier, "If I can find a market such as more than 500,000 kilograms per month, can you help me build such a large-scale casein glue factory?" 500,000 kilograms. Lavoisier was shocked. At present, the casein glue consumed in the whole of Europe may be only tens of thousands of kilograms a year. His Royal Highness the Crown Prince is going to sell 500,000 kilograms a month. This is incredible. But when he saw Joseph's serious expression, he began to think seriously. After a moment, he shook his head slightly and said, "Your Highness, it is impossible to produce 500,000 kilograms per month in a short period of time. If you are willing to invest 1 million livres, I can try to increase the output to 50,000 kilograms per month." 1 million livres. Joseph almost swore. When he started the United Steam Engine Company, the initial investment was only 1 million. How can this glue factory with a monthly output of 50,000 kilograms be compared with a steam engine? Chapter 374, the most advanced and most suitable. Lavoisier saw the crown prince's eyes glowing green and hurriedly explained, "Your Highness, if you only need 1 or 2,000 kilograms of casein glue every month, then you only need to invest 5,000 livres. But if it is 5,000 livres, 10,000 kilograms, then there will be a serious shortage of raw materials such as soda and water glass. Oh, the current soda production around Paris is only enough to produce 1,000 kilograms of casein glue per month, so you have to first invest in a workshop to make soda, and it's going to be huge. No, the production of soda requires the construction of a reverberatory furnace and a workshop for the production of sulfuric acid. This requires at least more than 800,000 livres. In addition, the production of water glass and the purification of slaked lime." Wait a minute. Joseph raised his hand to interrupt him. "You just said that a reverberatory furnace is needed to produce soda? If I understand correctly, it is the kind of reverberatory furnace used for steel making." "That's right, Your Highness." Lavoisier nodded. "You may not be familiar with the latest method of mass production of soda. That's a preparation method that Dr. Lebrun just invented. Mix salt and sulfuric acid, distill it, add limestone and coal, and then put it into a reverberatory furnace to calcine it into a molten state. This process needs to reach the temperature of melting iron, so the reverberatory furnace very suitable as." He told it. Joseph realized that the mass production of soda in this era still used calcination and crystallization methods. Just burning it to a high temperature of more than 1000 degrees consumes a huge amount of coal. Moreover, under high temperatures, sulfuric acid corrodes the reverberatory furnace very seriously. It is necessary to replace a set of reverberatory furnaces every 2 years. The cost is so low that it is genius. So for now, soda is still a chemical luxury product, the kind sold by gram. No wonder Lavoisier asked himself to invest 1 million livres to build it like a steel mill. The money might not be enough. Joseph immediately thought about it again. Isn't soda just sodium carbonate? That is soda ash. As one of the 5 pillars of the chemical industry. In order to reduce the cost of mass production, I don't know how many chemists were driven crazy. He couldn't help but exhale. Sure enough, all profitable commercial products must ultimately fall into the production of the most basic raw materials. Fortunately, thanks to my roommate in the chemistry department, I haven't given back all my chemistry knowledge to the teacher. For example, I know the House method of making alkali. Isn't this just going to kill those local methods you used at the end of the 18th century? I have never been able to spare the energy to engage in the chemical industry before. Now I'm taking this opportunity to start with soda ash. Isn't it just 1 million livres? If it can boost France's chemical industry, this little money will be nothing more than drizzle. Not to mention the importance of soda to the furniture revolution and bulletproof inserts. Even if you sell it directly, you can make 10 times the profit. Joseph immediately recalled Howe's process, looked at Lavoisier and said, "Actually, I have a brand new method of producing soda, and the cost should be less than 1/10 of the method you just mentioned." Lavoisier's eyes suddenly widened. If someone else had said this, he would probably laugh back immediately. But from the words of the son of God's favorite, he would have to seriously consider it. "Ah, you serious? Well, salt, ammonia and carbon dioxide are roughly used." Joseph did not hide it. The father of chemistry would not steal his own technology, or in other words, he would not dare. Moreover, I only knew the principles. To implement the specific mass production process, I had to consult Lavoisier. First, pass ammonia gas into saturated brine to form ammonia salt water. Then pass carbon dioxide into it to produce. After He finished explaining how's alkali making method. He waited for Lavoisier to exclaim point. However, after half a minute, the father of chemistry frowned and shook his head. Your Highness, your method is good, but it seems impossible to achieve it. Joseph was stunned immediately. What? Are you sure you heard clearly? This is Howe's method of making alkali. Lavoisier continued. Your method requires a large amount of ammonia. If I remember correctly, the price of soda seems to be 1 kilogram and 7 livres. The cost of the soda produced in this way is not higher than that of Dr. Lebrun's method is much lower. The most critical thing is that the supply of sand in Europe is difficult to meet the consumption of 50,000 kilograms of casein gum per month. Joseph blinked. Rincher? What is it? It's the mineral used to refine ammonia. As Lavoisier continued to explain for a long time, Joseph couldn't help but start to turn black. The iron sand should be ammonium chloride. Current chemical technology is unable to synthesize ammonia artificially and can only be obtained by calcining this expensive mineral. The price is sky high again. Only then did he remember that the ammonia synthesis process did not mature until the end of the 19th century. Dr. Howe invented the alkali production method in the 20th century. At that time, ammonia was already cheap. As for the synthesis of ammonia, it seems that ultra high temperature and high pressure reaction technology is used, which was not even necessary in the 18th century. So, the chemical industry and the furniture revolution are all just wishful thinking. Seeing his strange expression, Lavoisier hurriedly comforted him. Your Highness, your idea is very novel. And that method is something I have never thought of. It's just that sometimes the old methods may still work. Joseph smiled bitterly. He did not expect that Dr. Howe's improved alkali production method that shocked the world could not even be used by a reverberatory furnace in the 18th century. He couldn't help but think of the documentary about Dr. Howe that he had watched before, how he improved the Solvay process step by step under very difficult conditions and finally succeeded. He suddenly thought of something. What was Dr. Howe's improvement? It seemed to be joint alkali production, producing soda ash and fertilizer at the same time, which increased output and raw material utilization. How did the Solvay process make alkali? Joseph desperately recalled the documentary he had watched before, muttering to himself, salt plus ammonia plus carbon dioxide, dissolved in water. Remove the precipitate, add limestone, heat and react, ammonia and carbon dioxide are generated, and the sintered product is soda ash and calcium chloride, which are then purified by crystallization. This alkali production method wastes the chlorine in the salt and the calcium in the limestone, so the production efficiency and cost are not as good as the high alkali production method. Joseph suddenly paused. Wait, ammonia and carbon dioxide are precipitated during the reaction and can be added back to the next reaction. In this way, the consumption of ammonia will be very small. Although it did not produce as much fertilizer as Howe's, it bypassed the natural barrier of ammonia. Fortunately, he suddenly breathed a sigh of relief. He really fell into a misunderstanding. He always wanted to use the most advanced technology. But the most advanced technology may not be suitable for this era. Mr. Lavoisier, he smiled again. If I have a method that does not consume ammonia, please help me design the mass production process. Lavoisier's eyes suddenly widened. Was the prince really inspired by God? He came up with 2 plans for such cutting-edge technology in producing soda in less than half an hour! Chapter 375 Busy Lavoisier. If the previous step of high temperature generation of baking soda is no problem, Lavoisier pondered. Oh, I just have never conducted an experiment to make baking soda with ammonia. Not to question you, your highness. Other processes, such as collecting the released ammonia and carbonic acid gas, can be realized. The carbonic acid gas he mentioned is carbon dioxide. He was obviously very excited, looking at Joseph and said, then the price of producing soda using the method you mentioned will be only 1/10 of the current price. He is not only the most outstanding chemist of this era, but also has a good business mind. He immediately shook his head again. No, more than 1/10, because this method has no raw material restrictions. I mean, salt and lime are easy to obtain, so the output can be almost unlimited. Your Highness, I must return to the laboratory immediately to verify the method you mentioned. I swear, if this is feasible, it will definitely be a landmark event in the history of chemistry. He was not exaggerating at all. As the pillars of the chemical industry, the importance of 3 acids and 2 alkalis is self-evident. Among these 5 basic preparations, sulfuric acid and hydrochloric acid are relatively easy to obtain. Nitric acid, at the level of the 18th century, basically does not need to consider industrial production. Soda ash became the star of the chemical industry in the 19th century. In fact, the French government had previously offered a large reward to collect industrial methods for making soda ash. The winner was Dr. Leblanc, who produced soda ash using a reverberatory furnace. Although his method was expensive, it was still the most advanced technology of the era. And if Joseph's alkali method was put into production, it would directly turn him into slag. As the two were talking, the carriage stopped at the Tuileries Palace. Lavoisier was about to say goodbye and return to the laboratory, but he saw Mirabeau, who had been waiting here, hurried up to him, and saluted Joseph and said, "Your Highness, I heard that you left the Palace of Versailles, so I guessed that you might come here." He had a lot of industrial development matters to report to Joseph, but the prince had been busy in the arsenal before, and he disappeared as soon as he left the arsenal today. "It seems that you have a lot to tell me." Joseph smiled and saluted him. Indeed, Mirabeau was about to go to the office of the Industrial Planning Bureau with the prince, and when he turned around, he noticed Lavoisier and bowed to him. "Oh, Mr. Lavoisier, you are here too." "Oh, yes, but I'm leaving soon." Lavoisier touched his chest and saluted. "Your Highness told me a way to produce soda ash, and I just want to fly back to the laboratory immediately." Soda ash. Mirabeau was familiar with DuPont and had some understanding of the chemical industry. "That's amazing. Soda ash is a necessity for many chemical industries." When Joseph heard the word chemical industry, his heart moved immediately, and he pulled Lavoisier up to the 2nd floor. "Don't rush to conduct experiments. If we want to develop the chemical industry, we can't do without your expert advice." But Lavoisier entered the office of the Industrial Planning Bureau with some resistance, still thinking about the royal alkali process in his mind. This was the new name Joseph gave to the Solvay process. After all, Mr. Solvay was not born yet. But when he heard Joseph asking Mirabeau about the gas street lamp project, his attention was immediately drawn to it. Then, the supporting coal tar processing laboratory must speed up the progress. Joseph said, "Mr. Murdoch has obtained the coal distillation patent last month, and we will strive to start the construction of Paris gas street lamps before the end of the year." Mirabeau said with some embarrassment, "Your Highness, in fact, I have purchased all the experimental instruments according to the standards of the laboratory of the University of Paris, but the kind of benzene you mentioned has never been heard of by chemists." Joseph hurriedly looked at Lavoisier on the side, but saw that the latter was also at a loss. He suddenly felt helpless. It seemed that organic chemistry in this era was still a desert. Even the most basic organic matter, benzene, had not been discovered. He had to patiently explain to Lavoisier that coal tar contained a large amount of benzene, as well as other organic compounds such as aniline and phenol, and they could be extracted. Lavoisier's eyes lit up immediately. "You mean, there is a new substance in coal tar that we don't know yet?" "Yes, it's a bit complicated to say." Joseph didn't know where to start introducing organic chemistry for a while. After all, it was a very large subject. Finally, he had to cut the Gordian knot and said, "You distill coal tar, and in different temperature ranges, the distilled substances obtained will contain benzene. Oh, in this process, you will also discover some other new substances." Lavoisier's breathing became rapid. As a chemist, discovering a new substance is enough to make him famous in the academic world, but the prince told him lightly that simple operations can produce many new substances. Either His Highness is talking nonsense, or it must be a revelation from God. He subconsciously made a cross on his chest and said anxiously, "Your Highness, please let me handle the coal tar experiment." Joseph said with some embarrassment, "I really hope you can help, but you still have to help me design the production process of soda ash." This Lavoisier was not willing to give up, and hurriedly said, "Let my wife help. Please believe that she has a very good experimental level." Oh, I have many excellent students, and I will definitely not delay the royal alkali process from being put into production. Joseph smiled immediately. The Lavoisiers plus his students meant that nearly half of France's chemical elites had joined his project. He nodded to Lavoisier and said, "Since you are so interested, I will entrust you to take over the coal tar laboratory. You can apply directly to Count Mirabeau for the funds you need. Coal tar can be used to extract a large number of valuable compounds such as aniline and phenol, which are used to produce disinfectants, dyes, fragrances, and medicines, especially the first two. Phenol, as the earliest medical disinfectant, has saved the lives of countless patients. This thing is much cheaper than alcohol. After all, it is a product of coal tar waste utilization and can be used on a large scale to disinfect the entire building or the entire camp. And aniline as a raw material for dye production. Its economic value is simply amazing. You know, the purple dye extracted from plants is used in the fashion field, and the price is even more expensive in the clothes themselves, even for the nobles of the Palace of Versailles, who can wear a full purple dress as a face-saving thing. It was not until the introduction of aniline purple made from aniline that purple clothing finally entered the homes of ordinary people. If this dye is put into production, it will also become a powerful weapon for the French textile industry to compete with the British. Joseph stopped fantasizing. After all, the organic chemical industry is still a bit far away. Even Lavoisier didn't know what benzene was, and it was unknown how long it would take to create an industry. The current priority is to implement the production of soda ash as soon as possible. Use soda ash to establish a chemical industry chain and get dividends from it. End of this chapter. Thank you very much for reaching the end. Don't forget to like. Looking for more exclusive content and immediate access? Subscribe to our Patreon. Remember, every like, subscription, or donation encourages us to continue. Thanks to everyone. See you in the next video.